I wasn't supposed to be out here. I knew that even as I trudged through the thick underbrush, my legs aching and my feet covered in scratches. The woods looked different now that the sun was starting to dip behind the trees. The shadows stretched long and thin, and the air had that cold, crisp feel to it, like the kind of evening where you start second-guessing everything. I should have turned back hours ago, but I didn't. I was too stubborn for that. I had made the mistake of following that trail, convinced I could navigate it back to the main path. A small hike, just an hour or so out, I told myself, no big deal. But as the minutes stretched on, I realized how far off I'd gone, how the trees had become denser and the ground uneven. It all started when I noticed the path wasn't as clear anymore. The trail markers were few and far between, and the small, worn trail I'd been walking on was becoming harder to follow. At first, I didn't think much of it. I figured I'd just take a few more steps, and I'd find my bearings. But the longer I went, the more lost I felt. There was nothing but trees, rows of tall, spindly trunks that looked like they went on forever. The ground beneath my boots was uneven, the roots crisscrossing like a tangled mess of veins, and the leaves, thick and damp from the recent rain, made it hard to get a good footing. I tried to backtrack, but the forest had already swallowed up my footsteps. The air was still, almost unnervingly so. I couldn't hear anything. No birds, no wind, no sound at all except for the pounding of my heart in my ears. I kept walking, telling myself that I could figure this out. I had a phone in my pocket, and I'd seen the map before I started. The idea of being lost didn't seem real to me then. But now, the quiet weighed on me, and the farther I went, the more that dread settled deep in my stomach. The branches above creaked, and I froze. I wasn't sure what I'd heard, but something made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I could feel the weight of the woods pressing in on me. The trees were so close together now, the spaces between them narrow, and the canopy above had thickened to the point where hardly any light filtered through. Felt wrong. I checked my phone, hoping for some kind of reassurance, but the screen was blank. No signal. Of course, I should have known better than to rely on it. I had a compass in my pack, though. Still, it wasn't much help when the world around me looked like an endless sea of green. Minutes turned to hours. I hadn't planned to stay out this long, but there I was. The sun was almost completely gone, and the sky was a dull, deep blue, the kind that made everything look like a shadow. I tried to steady my breathing to keep myself calm. I wasn't panicking. I told myself that, but the trees around me, they seemed taller, more imposing now, like they were watching me. The path, if you could even call it a path, had all but disappeared. I checked my watch. It was nearly 7 p.m. I should have been back by now. I knew the smart thing would be to stop and stay put until morning. But something inside of me kept pushing forward, as though I might stumble across the trail any second now. And then, just when I thought things couldn't get worse, I heard something. A snap, far off in the distance. I stopped dead in my tracks, holding my breath. My first thought was that it was an animal, a deer maybe, or even a bear. I had read that bears were active at this time of year, and I had heard the stories, how they were territorial, how they might come closer to human areas during certain seasons. But this, it didn't feel like an animal. It didn't feel like anything natural. The snap came again, closer this time. Too close. My heart skipped a beat. I wanted to turn and run, but I stood frozen, listening. There was no rustling of leaves, no movement from the forest floor, just that eerie, sharp crack of a branch breaking. My mind raced. Who else could be out here? I took a slow step backward, trying to make no noise, my breath shallow. It was then that I realized how silent the forest had become. Everything had stopped. Not a bird, not a breeze. It was just me and the unsettling crackling of the branches in the distance. I had to get out. I had to find the path. I stumbled forward, heart pounding. Every crack of a branch, Every rustle of leaves seemed louder now, like the entire forest was alive and aware of me. I had never felt so small, so exposed. I told myself not to look back, but the urge was unbearable. I had to know if I was being followed, or if it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. I turned my head just for a second, and that was when I saw it. In the far distance, between two massive trees, there was a figure. At first, I thought it was a person, maybe another hiker, someone who had gotten lost too. But as I stared, I saw the truth. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, half hidden in the shadow of the trees. And it wasn't human. It was too tall, too still. My blood ran cold. I turned away quickly, my feet slipping on the wet ground as I tried to scramble in the opposite direction. My head was spinning. I needed to get out, but the trees felt like they were closing in on me, the path I was following becoming more and more indistinct. I was lost, completely, utterly lost. Minutes, maybe hours, passed, but I didn't know how long I had been walking. The sky was dark now, and the air had turned colder. My hands were numb, my legs were stiff, and I was beginning to feel dizzy. I wasn't sure if it was the exhaustion or the fear, but I had started to hallucinate. In the corner of my eye, I saw the figure again. This time, it wasn't far away, not in the distance. It was right there between two trees, standing motionless. I gasped, stumbling back, but I refused to look again. Couldn't. My breath was ragged, and I pushed myself faster through the woods, hands shaking as I gripped the branches around me, pushing through the underbrush. I needed to get out, but where was the way? Then, in the distance, I saw something, a clearing, a real open space. There was light, not much, but enough to make me feel like I wasn't completely losing my mind. I bolted toward it, the last reserves of my energy fueling me forward. I stepped out into the clearing, and there it was, the road, the main road. A trailhead sign was just a few yards away, half hidden in the overgrowth. The relief was so overwhelming that I almost collapsed. I was shaking, covered in dirt, branches tangled in my hair, but I had made it. I looked back toward the woods, that dense, endless thicket of trees that had felt like it was closing in on me. But now it was just quiet, peaceful even. There was no sign of the figure, no snap of branches. Just the familiar sight of the woods behind me, harmless now. I swallowed hard, trying to calm my frantic breathing. I wasn't sure what had happened in those woods. What I'd seen, what I'd heard. It didn't make sense. Maybe it was exhaustion or the isolation, but there was no denying that I had been scared out of my mind. I didn't know if I'd ever return to those woods again, but for now I was safe. The trees were behind me, and I could finally breathe. I love camping. I've done it countless times, sometimes solo, sometimes with friends. The isolation, the fresh air, the quiet, there's nothing quite like it. I thought I was prepared for everything the wilderness could throw at me. I was wrong. This story isn't about some ghost or creature lurking in the woods. It's about something far more real and far more terrifying. It started with a weekend trip to a place called Devil's Ridge. A little dramatic for a name, sure, but it was remote, and that's what I wanted, complete solitude for a couple of days. I had just finished a brutal few weeks at work and needed some peace and quiet. No phone, no emails, no people. Just me, the trees, and my tent. I packed light but smart, tent, sleeping bag, enough food for 3 days, plenty of water, a knife, a first aid kit, a headlamp, and my reliable old hiking boots. My phone was fully charged, but there wouldn't be any service out there. I didn't mind. The less connected I was, the better. The drive out took about 4 hours. The last hour was a bumpy dirt road that wound its way up into the mountains. By the time I reached the trailhead, it was late afternoon. The sky was clear, and the sun was starting to dip toward the horizon, casting long shadows through the trees. I slung my pack over my shoulders, locked the car, and set off down the trail. The plan was to hike about 5 miles in, set up camp near a small creek I'd marked on my map, and spend the weekend exploring the area. The trail was well-worn but empty. No other hikers in sight. Perfect. The only sounds were the crunch of my boots on the dirt and the occasional bird call. After about an hour, I reached the creek. It was exactly as I'd imagined. Clear, cold water running over smooth rocks, surrounded by tall pines. I found a flat spot a few yards from the water and set up camp. The air was cool, but not cold. The smell of pine and damp earth filled my nose. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and got a small fire going. Dinner was simple, dehydrated chili and a granola bar. I ate slowly, enjoying the quiet and the crackle of the fire. As the sun sank behind the mountains, the shadows deepened, and the forest grew dark. I watched the fire until it burned down to embers, then crawled into my tent. I zipped up my sleeping bag and closed my eyes. I woke up to the sound of something snapping in the woods, a branch maybe 20 yards away. My eyes shot open. It was pitch black inside the tent, and for a moment I wasn't sure where I was. Then it came back to me, Devil's Ridge, the creek, the tent. I listened, holding my breath. Crunch. Another sound. Closer this time. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Not an animal. I've been in the woods enough to know what a deer or a raccoon sounds like. This was different. Heavy. Human. My heart started to race. I told myself it was probably another camper. Maybe they'd lost the trail and were trying to find their way back. But something about the way the footsteps moved didn't feel right. They were too slow, too careful. I reached for my headlamp and clicked it on. The inside of the tent lit up, but I couldn't see anything beyond the thin fabric. The footsteps had stopped. The only sound was the creek, gurgling softly in the dark. I waited, straining to hear anything else. Minutes passed. Nothing. I told myself I was being paranoid. I'd been out here all day without seeing a single soul. What were the chances someone would just happen to stumble across my camp in the middle of the night? I took a deep breath, turned off the headlamp, and lay back down. I didn't sleep. The next morning, everything felt normal again. The sun was shining, birds were singing, and the forest looked almost friendly in the daylight. I told myself the footsteps had just been my imagination. Maybe a tree branch falling, or some animal I didn't recognize. I spent the day hiking and exploring the area. I found an old logging road that hadn't been used in years, followed it for a while, then looped back toward camp. The whole time, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every so often, I'd stop and look around, but there was never anyone there, just trees and shadows. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that I'd spooked myself the night before and was jumping at shadows. By the time I got back to camp, it was late afternoon. I built another fire, boiled some water for instant noodles, and tried to relax. As the sun set, the unease returned. The shadows grew longer, and the friendly forest from earlier in the day turned dark and silent. I kept the fire going longer than usual, feeding it stick after stick until I had a roaring blaze. I sat with my back to the tent, facing the woods, listening. Nothing. Eventually, the fire burned down to embers. I considered staying up all night, but I was exhausted. I crawled into the tent, leaving the headlamp on this time. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself that everything was fine. I woke up to the sound of footsteps again, closer this time. My heart was pounding in my chest. I sat up, gripping the knife I'd left next to my sleeping bag. The footsteps stopped just outside the tent. I held my breath, listening. A faint rustling sound. Someone or something was brushing against the side of the tent. I swallowed hard, my throat dry as sandpaper. My mind was racing. What the hell was I supposed to do? Burst out of the tent and confront whoever was out there? Stay inside and hope they went away? The rustling stopped. The footsteps started again, moving away from the tent, back toward the woods. I waited, counting the seconds. 10, 20, 30. I unzipped the tent as quietly as I could and stepped outside, knife in hand. The fire had burned down to ashes, and the forest was dark. My headlamp cast a narrow beam of light that barely pierced the shadows. There was no one there. I scanned the trees, my pulse hammering in my ears. The forest was silent, watching. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. To first light, I packed up my gear. I wasn't sticking around to find out what or who had been outside my tent. I hiked back to the trailhead as fast as I could, my head on a swivel the whole time. Every snapping branch, every rustling leaf sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. When I finally reached my car, I threw my pack in the back, jumped into the driver's seat, and locked the doors. My hands were shaking as I turned the key and started the engine. As I drove back down the dirt road, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone step out of the trees behind me. But there was nothing, just the empty road and the endless forest. It wasn't until I hit the highway that I started to feel safe again. Looking back, I don't know what really happened out there. Maybe it was just some random hiker who didn't realize how creepy they were being. Maybe it was something worse. I'll never know. What I do know is this: I haven't been camping since, and I don't think I ever will. It had been one of those weeks. Heavy rain, work piling up, stress eating at me like a slow burn. The kind of week where even the thought of seeing another person felt exhausting. So when I found this cabin, deep in the woods, tucked away from everything, I knew I needed it. A weekend alone, no distractions, just time to breathe. I didn't think much about the location when I booked it online. It had great reviews, looked charming, and there was a fireplace. That was all I needed. Driving out there, the city felt like it was slipping further and further behind me. The roads narrowed, becoming rougher and less traveled, until even my GPS couldn't keep up. The rain was still falling, relentless. The wipers on my car couldn't seem to wipe fast enough. The kind of rain that makes everything seem just a little bit more surreal. After about an hour of winding, barely visible roads, I saw it. A small, isolated cabin, sitting quietly in the woods. The porch light flickered against the dark, wet trees. There was no one else around. It felt like the entire forest had swallowed the road leading here. I pulled up, grabbed my bag, and took a quick look around. The trees were so dense, it felt like I was in a different world. The only sounds were the steady thrum of rain and the occasional creak of the trees swaying in the wind. The door creaked as I pushed it open, the hinges groaning. Inside, it was everything I wanted: cozy, warm, and simple. A small wooden living room with an old-fashioned fireplace. A couple of mismatched chairs, a table, and a thick rug. The kitchen was compact, but well-equipped. It was a far cry from the stress of my daily life, and I felt the tension in my shoulders start to ease. But something wasn't right. I couldn't quite put my finger on it. It was the way the silence felt too thick, the way the air seemed just a little heavier than it should have been. Maybe it was just the isolation, or the fact that I hadn't been alone in nature for so long. I shook it off, telling myself it was just nerves. I unpacked my things, stoked the fire, and started making a simple dinner. The rain was still hammering on the roof, but I felt comfortable, safe in the little bubble of warmth I had created. It wasn't until I started to settle in for the night that things started to feel off. I'd set up my sleeping bag on the couch, planning to fall asleep to the crackling fire, but every time I tried to relax, I felt a sharp discomfort in my chest. My eyes kept darting to the windows. The rain outside was now more of a downpour, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. The first time it happened, I chalked it up to my imagination. There was a soft, almost imperceptible tapping on the window. I stood up quickly, my heart racing, but there was nothing there. Just rain pouring down in sheets, the night stretching out beyond the glass. I tried to laugh it off. It was just the wind, I thought, or maybe an animal brushing against the window. But as I sat back down, it happened again. This time louder, sharper. Tap, tap, tap right against the glass. I froze. My heart skipped. My first thought was that it was a person, but who would be out here, especially in this storm? No one. It was absurd. I stood up slowly, walking toward the window. The rain blurred the outside world, and I couldn't see anything beyond the dark, wet trees. I stayed by the window for a few minutes, my mind running through all kinds of possibilities, none of them comforting. I wanted to go to bed, forget about it, but my body wouldn't let me. The feeling of being watched didn't go away. Eventually, I made my way to the bedroom. It felt like the kind of room where, if I kept my eyes closed, I could convince myself it was safe. The bed was small but comfortable, and I pulled the thick blankets up around my shoulders. The warmth of the fire was still with me, wrapping me in a comforting haze. But sleep didn't come. The tapping came again, this time from the direction of the front door. My heart was pounding now, and my mind was racing with possibilities. Was someone out there? Was I imagining it? What should I do? Should I check? But I didn't want to leave the safety of the room. I lay still, straining to hear, every little creak of the cabin setting me on edge. The tapping persisted. It didn't stop. I thought about calling someone, but who would I even call out here? There was no cell service, no signal at all. My phone was just a dead weight in my pocket. I had to check, couldn't ignore it. I grabbed a flashlight, took a deep breath, and stood up. The air was colder now, and the fire felt distant. My footsteps felt too loud as I walked through the dark cabin, the sound of the rain intensifying as I neared the door. The tapping didn't stop, but I noticed it was coming in a pattern now. 3 taps, pause, 3 taps, pause. Whoever was out there wasn't trying to hide. They were taunting me. I reached for the door handle, but just as my hand brushed it, a loud, deafening crash came from the back of the cabin. It sounded like someone had thrown a rock or something heavy against the wall. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The tapping on the door stopped immediately. I turned slowly, my heart thudding in my chest. I couldn't see anything from the back of the cabin, just the dim light from the flashlight reflecting off the wooden walls. But I knew there was something or someone out there. The room felt smaller now. The walls seemed to close in on me. My skin was crawling, but I forced myself to move. Slowly, I crept toward the back door, shining the flashlight over the floorboards, the corners, the window that faced the woods. There was nothing, no sign of what had caused the noise. I considered my options. I could run. I could grab my things and head back down the mountain in the middle of the night, but that felt just as dangerous as staying. There was something unsettlingly final about this place, like it had its own rules. I stayed, pacing back and forth in the cabin, unsure of what to do next. The rain didn't stop, poured and poured, beating on the windows like a drum. The storm didn't let up, and I felt the weight of isolation pressing harder on me. By morning, the storm was still raging, but I had finally fallen asleep, exhausted from the anxiety and adrenaline. I woke to a silence so sudden it was jarring. The storm had passed, the rain gone, the sky clear. When I stepped outside to get some air, I noticed something that made my stomach churn. The path leading up to the cabin was dotted with footprints. Not just one set, multiple. The tracks were fresh, and they went all the way up to the porch. My blood ran cold as I looked at the marks in the mud. Whoever had been out there wasn't some random stranger. They had been watching me, and they'd been close enough to leave their mark on the ground. I didn't stay long enough to look around more. I grabbed my bag, jumped in the car, and drove back down the mountain, my hands shaking on the wheel. I couldn't get out of there fast enough. I never went back to that cabin, and I never found out who had been out there in the woods. But I learned one thing. Some places, no matter how peaceful they seem, hold more than just the memories of their past. They hold something else, something waiting. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend, just a short drive to get away from the noise, the constant buzz of the city, the stress of work. I found the cabin online. The listing said it was remote, nestled deep in the woods with no neighbors for miles. The pictures were beautiful, just the kind of place I thought I could relax and clear my head. A cozy log cabin surrounded by dense trees, a small lake nearby, and a sense of isolation that I thought would be refreshing. It seemed perfect for what I needed. The drive there took longer than I expected. The GPS kept cutting out as I got deeper into the woods, and the road became less of a road and more of a dirt path. The trees were thick, their trunks so close together that it felt like I was driving through a green tunnel. I hadn't seen another car in hours. The air smelled different here, fresher, but also damp, like the earth had been soaked for days. Every time I looked in the rearview mirror, I felt like something was watching me, but I brushed it off. My mind was just playing tricks. When I finally arrived, the cabin looked exactly like in the pictures. Rustic, charming, with a small porch that overlooked the lake. It was the kind of place that felt like it was stuck in time. I could hear the soft chirping of crickets, the rustling of the trees, and the occasional splash of a fish in the lake. Everything felt peaceful, almost too peaceful. I unpacked my car and brought in my things. It wasn't long before I had the fire going inside and the cabin felt warm. I could hear the crackle of the wood as the flames danced. I made myself a cup of tea and settled into one of the armchairs by the window, watching the sun begin to set over the water. It looked like the kind of sunset you only see in pictures, pink and orange streaks across the sky. For a moment, I thought maybe this weekend would be just what I needed. As night fell, the air grew colder. The only sounds were the fire in the hearth and the occasional gust of wind outside. I wrapped myself in a blanket and turned off the lights, letting the fire provide the only glow in the room. I could hear the wind howling through the trees now, a constant low moan that seemed to shake the walls. It didn't bother me at first, but as the hours wore on, it started to get to me. Around midnight, I decided to go to bed. The bed was comfortable, the sheets cool against my skin. But as I lay there, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The wind outside was louder now, and every now and then I thought I heard something scratching at the walls, just soft enough that it could have been the trees rubbing against the cabin. Still, the sound made me uneasy. I tried to ignore it, closing my eyes and taking deep breaths. I was in the middle of nowhere, and there was no reason to be scared. Yet, the sense of isolation felt heavier now. The idea that there was nothing around for miles. The nearest town was an hour away, the nearest person even further. It was quiet here, too quiet. It made me feel exposed, like I was too far from safety. Eventually, I fell asleep, but it didn't last long. The sound of something scraping at the window woke me. At first, I thought it was just the wind again, but then I heard it, sharp, deliberate, like fingernails on glass. My heart started pounding as I sat up in bed, straining to listen. It was hard to tell where the sound was coming from, but it felt close, too close. I got out of bed and crept to the window, my pulse racing in the silence. Outside, the trees were dark shadows, the night swallowing up everything beyond the porch. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, and the lake shimmered faintly, reflecting the little light that made it through. But there was nothing there. I told myself it was just an animal, a raccoon or some other small creature, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I decided to lock the windows and double-check the doors, just to be sure. When I did, I noticed something strange. There was dirt on the doorknob, like someone had been standing there, pressing against it, but I hadn't seen anyone. I hadn't heard any footsteps. My mind raced. Maybe it was just a mistake. Maybe I was being paranoid, but I couldn't ignore the feeling creeping up my spine. I went back to bed but couldn't sleep. The noise outside had stopped, but now I couldn't stop thinking about it. I lay there in the dark, listening to the wind, trying to calm my thoughts. But every time I closed my eyes, the image of that dirt on the doorknob kept coming back. In the morning, I went outside to clear my head. The sun was just beginning to rise, painting the sky with shades of gold and pink. The lake looked peaceful, and the trees were still. But as I walked around the cabin, I noticed something odd. There were fresh footprints in the mud leading up to the porch. They weren't there the night before, I was sure of it. The prints were deep, like someone had been walking around the cabin for hours, pacing back and forth. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. It wasn't just that there were footprints, it was the fact that they were fresh. No one had passed by here in days. I hadn't seen anyone, I hadn't heard anyone. And yet here they were, large, heavy prints in the soft mud. I backed away from the porch and stood still, trying to think. My phone had no signal, of course. The cabin was supposed to be off the grid, but that meant I was completely isolated. I didn't want to panic, but the evidence was there. Someone had been here. Someone had been watching me. For the next couple of hours, I tried to convince myself I was just overreacting. Maybe it was just some hikers or campers who had passed through. Maybe they had stayed the night, not realizing the cabin was occupied. But the more I thought about it, the less likely that seemed. The prints weren't from a casual walk. They were deliberate, heavy. They didn't look like someone passing through. They looked like someone who had been waiting. By mid-afternoon, I decided I couldn't stay there any longer. The thought of being alone in that cabin, with the strange noises and the footprints, was too much. I packed up my things quickly, more hastily than I would have liked. The whole time, I felt like someone was just outside the window, watching, waiting. The cabin felt suffocating now, like it had turned against me. I was halfway to my car when I heard it again, the soft scratching at the window. I froze, heart pounding in my chest. I turned slowly, half expecting to see someone standing there, but there was nothing. The window was shut tight, the glass still. I quickly jumped into my car, locked the doors, and started the engine, desperate to leave. As I drove away, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see headlights following me, or worse, someone walking behind me in the woods. But there was nothing, just the winding road, the trees, and the empty miles stretching ahead. I didn't stop until I hit the main highway, where I finally felt some relief. The city seemed so far away, but the sense of safety that came with it was undeniable. As I drove home, I kept replaying the events in my mind, wondering if I had imagined it all. But the footprints, the noise, the strange feeling of being watched, it was real. I never went back to that cabin, but I've often wondered, especially on quiet nights when I'm alone, if someone was truly out there, waiting for me, or if it was something else entirely, something that the woods had claimed long before I ever arrived. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend getaway, just a break from the rush, the noise, the constant pressure, a chance to reset. The cabin, tucked far away from any nearby towns or civilization, seemed perfect. Nestled deep in the woods, accessible only by a winding dirt road, it promised peace and solitude.
No distractions.
Just the wind rustling through the trees and the occasional bird call. I thought I'd leave behind the chaos of my everyday life and find some kind of clarity. The drive there had been longer than I expected. The further I went, the more isolated the place seemed. The pavement turned to gravel, then dirt, and eventually, there was no road at all, just a narrow, overgrown path that seemed to disappear into the forest. Felt like the world was closing in on me. First, I brushed it off. The air was fresh. The forest smelled like pine and damp earth. I rolled down my windows, letting the breeze flow through the car, hoping the fresh air would calm my nerves. The GPS had dropped out hours ago, and my phone had no signal, but I wasn't too worried. I had the directions written down, and I had seen the cabin on the map. When I finally reached the cabin, it wasn't as charming as I had imagined. The wood was weathered, the windows dark, and there was an odd silence about the place. It didn't look like anyone had been there in months, maybe even longer. There were no signs of life, no mail in the box, no car parked nearby, no footprints in the yard. Just an empty, forgotten place. I had seen the photos online when I booked it. Beautiful, rustic, warm. But reality was different. There was something off about the place, a lingering feeling I couldn't shake. I tried to ignore it. The last thing I needed was to let my mind wander into overdrive. I spent the first hour unpacking and getting settled. The air inside the cabin smelled faintly of wood, dust, and something else, something strange. A musty scent I couldn't identify. I opened the windows to let in some light and fresh air. The rooms were sparsely furnished, but it had everything I needed. A small kitchenette, a bedroom with a king-sized bed, and a living area with a cracked fireplace. It was cozy, if not a little too quiet. After I made some tea and ate, I decided to take a walk around the property. It was mid-afternoon by this point, and the sun was still high, casting long shadows on the forest floor. I figured I could explore a bit before it got dark. The woods surrounding the cabin were thick, but the trail was easy to follow. The ground was soft underfoot, covered in pine needles, moss, and fallen leaves. I wandered farther than I intended, lost in my thoughts. I wasn't paying much attention to my surroundings, just walking and breathing in the cool, fresh air. It was then that I noticed the strange marks on the trees. At first, I thought it was just natural wear, maybe scratches from animals or weathering from the elements. But the deeper I went, the more I saw long, deep gouges running up the trunks. They were too precise, too deliberate to be the result of wind or animals. Some of them were fresh, the bark still shredded, like something had clawed at the trees with incredible force. I stopped, a shiver crawling up my spine. I looked around, but there was nothing unusual. The forest felt unnervingly still. There wasn't even the typical sound of insects or birds, just silence. I tried to shake off the feeling of unease that started to creep up on me. Maybe it was just some animals or something else that I wasn't familiar with. But as I made my way back to the cabin, I couldn't help but feel like I wasn't alone. That night, things only got worse. The quiet, which had once seemed peaceful, now felt oppressive. The wind howled through the trees outside, rattling the windows, but there was no rain, no storm, just an unnatural gust that shook the whole cabin. The fire crackled in the hearth, but it wasn't enough to push back the chill. I pulled a blanket around me and tried to watch TV, but there was nothing on. The signal was dead. Around 11 p.m., I heard it, a noise that was hard to place at first, but unmistakable once I focused on it. Faint scratching. At first, I thought it was just the wind, or maybe an animal outside, but then it came again, closer this time. A low, rhythmic scraping against the side of the house. My heart began to race. I told myself to stay calm. It could just be a branch brushing against the cabin, or maybe an animal wandering too close. But as the sound continued, I couldn't ignore the growing feeling that something, or someone, was out there. I grabbed a flashlight and went to the front door, peering through the small window next to it. The darkness outside was absolute. The beam of the flashlight barely cut through it. I saw nothing, just the dense trees surrounding the cabin. But the scratching was still there, now louder and more frantic. My thoughts spiraled. What if someone had been out there all along? What if I wasn't alone in the woods? I didn't want to believe it. I told myself it was nothing, but the thought gnawed at me, and I couldn't shake the unease that had taken over my entire body. I checked the locks on the door and windows again, then again just to be sure. I stayed up most of the night, listening to the occasional scraping sound, feeling like my skin was crawling. It didn't help that the wind had picked up, now howling like a living thing, but the noise outside didn't match the wind. It was something deliberate, something intentional. At some point, I must have fallen asleep, though I don't remember when. I woke up suddenly, in the dead of night, my body frozen in fear. The cabin was silent now. No wind, no scratching. Just the quiet hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the soft creak of the house settling. But then came the knock. It was soft at first, almost like a tap, but it was unmistakable. A knock at the front door. I held my breath, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. I didn't move, didn't even dare to blink. The knock came again, this time louder and more insistent. I was terrified. My mind raced, but I couldn't think clearly. I thought about the scratches on the trees, the eerie silence in the woods, the scraping noises from outside the night before. My heart was pounding in my chest, my palms sweating. I told myself it was just a person, a lost traveler, maybe. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I decided to check the peephole on the door. Slowly, I moved toward it, my hands shaking. I pressed my eye to the small lens, scanning the area outside. There was no one there. Relief flooded through me for a split second, but then I noticed something. In the shadows just beyond the porch light, there was a shape, a figure standing motionless. It was too dark to see clearly, but it was tall and unnaturally still. I stepped back from the door, my breath catching in my throat. The knock came again, this time with more force. I didn't know what to do. I felt trapped. There was nowhere to run, no one around for miles. My mind raced through every possibility. Could it be someone playing a prank? Or was it something far worse? I slowly backed away from the door, holding my breath. The figure outside didn't move. It stood there in the dark, unmoving, like a shadow in the night. Then, as if on cue, the figure turned and disappeared into the trees. I stood frozen for a long time, too afraid to move, too afraid to breathe. The silence outside was deafening. I waited, listening for any sign of movement. There was nothing, just the sound of my own heartbeat thumping in my ears. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my keys and bolted out of the cabin, not caring about anything else. I didn't look back as I drove away, the dark woods fading in the rearview mirror. I never found out who or what was out there that night, but I never went back to that cabin, and I never will. Whatever it was, whatever was lurking out there in the woods was real, and it still haunts me to this day. I didn't expect it to go this way. No one could have, really. The cabin had seemed like the perfect getaway at first. Quiet, remote, and nestled deep in the woods. I'd been wanting a break for so long, just a few days away from the city, from the constant noise, the people, the clutter, a place to clear my head, breathe, and relax. I found the place online. The listing looked good. An isolated cabin, no neighbors, miles from the nearest road. Just the kind of solitude I needed. I thought it would be easy. Just pack a bag, rent the place, and head out. Simple. But the second I arrived, things started to feel off. The cabin itself was small, built from dark wood, its edges weathered and rough, giving off an old-world charm. It sat near the edge of a dense forest. The trees, tall and ancient, lined the property, their branches heavy with the weight of winter. The whole area was eerily quiet, except for the occasional rustling of leaves in the breeze. The moment I stepped out of the car, I felt it, the silence. It was so thick, like the air was holding its breath, and the ground felt unnaturally still beneath my feet. I shook it off, though. I mean, what else could I do? I was already there. It wasn't like I could just turn around and leave. The interior of the cabin was exactly what I expected. Cozy but bare. There was a small kitchen, a living area with a sofa and a fireplace, and a bedroom with a big bed covered in an old quilt. It smelled musty, like dust and forgotten memories, but not in a bad way. It had character, the kind of character that made you feel like you were stepping into something that had been there far longer than you had. I unpacked quickly, trying to ignore the strange sense of unease settling in my chest. Something felt wrong, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. Maybe it was just the isolation. I'd never spent this much time alone before, not in a place like this. Sure, I'd been on camping trips and stayed at cabins before, but this one felt different. The first night went by uneventfully. I ate a simple dinner, read a little, and went to bed. The bed creaked under me, but I still managed to fall asleep despite the odd noises coming from outside. The wind, the cracking of branches, the occasional screech of some animal in the distance. Nothing out of the ordinary, right? I woke up the next morning to sunlight streaming through the windows, and for a brief moment, I felt calm again. It was going to be a peaceful retreat, I told myself. Just a few days to reset. But as I ventured outside to stretch my legs, something made me pause. A strange marking on the cabin's front door. At first, I thought it was a smudge, maybe dirt or something left by the wind. But when I looked closer, I realized it was a symbol. A crude drawing, scratched into the wood, almost like someone had carved it there recently. It was a circle with jagged lines coming off it, like lightning bolts or something more abstract. My heart raced for a second, but I pushed the thought out of my mind. It's probably nothing, I whispered to myself. Maybe it's just old. I tried to move past it. I spent the day hiking around the area, exploring the forest, and taking photos of the landscape. The silence was suffocating, though. Not the peaceful kind of silence you get in nature, but a heavy, watchful kind of silence, as if the woods were waiting for something. Every now and then, I'd feel like I was being watched, like eyes were on me from the trees, though when I looked, nothing was there. That night, I sat by the fire, just staring into the flames, thinking about how weirdly tense I'd felt all day. It was like I wasn't alone. I heard things that didn't make sense. Faint rustling noises, branches snapping just outside the cabin. Nothing too loud, but it was enough to keep me on edge. I didn't sleep well that night. I woke up several times, drenched in sweat, my heart pounding as if I'd been running. But each time I looked around the room, the shadows seemed normal. The cabin was still. No signs of anything unusual. I told myself it was just the nerves, the quiet, getting to me. By the third day, the unease had deepened. Every time I stepped outside, the woods felt closer, like they were encroaching on the cabin. The trees felt too thick, their limbs too twisted. I felt like I couldn't escape them, no matter which direction I walked in. Then, as I ventured deeper into the woods, I found something. A trail, not a hiking trail, not something that seemed man-made or regularly used. It was faint, hidden beneath the fallen leaves, barely visible unless you were really looking for it. My curiosity got the better of me and I followed it. The trail wound deeper into the forest, growing darker as the trees thickened around me. The air felt heavier here, the silence even more pronounced. I could barely hear anything but my own breathing and the occasional crunch of leaves underfoot. It wasn't until I stumbled upon a clearing that I realized how far I'd gone. In the middle of the clearing was an old structure. It looked like an abandoned shed or a small cabin, but it was barely standing. Its roof had caved in, and the walls were covered in moss and vines. A feeling of dread washed over me. I should have turned back, but instead I walked closer. The door was ajar, and when I pushed it open, the smell hit me. Damp, moldy, decayed. The inside was empty, save for a few rusted tools scattered on the ground. But then, on the far wall, something caught my eye. More symbols. The same kind I'd seen on the cabin door. Crude, jagged markings etched into the wood, almost like they were trying to communicate something. I backed away, my pulse racing, my hands shaking. I wasn't sure what I had stumbled into, but I didn't want to find out. The walk back to the cabin felt longer. The trees seemed to press in on me, their branches reaching out like claws, the ground beneath me uneven and treacherous. When I finally made it back, I locked the door behind me, and for the first time since I arrived, I didn't feel safe. That night, I stayed up late, my eyes flicking between the dark corners of the room and the window, expecting to see something, someone, watching me. But there was nothing, just the oppressive silence, the weight of the woods pressing in on the cabin. Couldn't sleep. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that I wasn't supposed to be here. By the fourth day, I knew I had to leave. The cabin felt wrong. The woods felt wrong. And no matter how much I tried to convince myself that I was just being paranoid, I knew something was off. The unease in my chest had shifted into something darker, something more primal. Fear. I packed my bags, grabbed my keys, and headed for the door. But before I left, I stood there for a moment, staring at the strange symbol on the door again. The feeling in the pit of my stomach twisted. I wasn't sure what it meant, but I was starting to believe that it wasn't just some random marking. Just as I was about to leave, I heard it, a noise from outside, faint rustling. At first, I thought it was the wind, but it sounded different. It was too rhythmic, too deliberate. I froze, my hand on the doorknob, listening. It was coming closer, a slow shuffle of footsteps, soft but unmistakable. My heart hammered in my chest. I didn't want to look, but I had to. I cracked the door open, just a sliver, peeking through. There was nothing there, just the trees, the shadows. But then I saw something else, a figure, standing in the distance, partially hidden by the trees. Tall, thin, unmoving, watching. I slammed the door shut, my breath caught in my throat. I couldn't stay here. Not anymore. I ran to the car. I didn't look back. I didn't care about the bags I left behind or the cabin that had once seemed so inviting. The only thing that mattered was getting away. The drive back felt endless, my mind racing. Was I being followed? Was I imagining things? What was that figure? I didn't stop until I was back in the city, safe. But every time I close my eyes, I see it again, the figure standing between the trees, waiting. The air was cold, crisp, and carried the unmistakable scent of pine as I set off on my hike. I'd planned this trip for weeks, eager to explore the secluded trail that wound through the mountains. It was early autumn, and the woods were beginning to change, the leaves turning various shades of amber, rust, and gold. I had no intention of rushing. This was my time to disconnect from the world, to leave behind the noise of work and technology. Just me, nature, and the quiet. The trail was marked clearly with yellow blazes, winding through the dense forest. I had been hiking for about an hour, enjoying the solitude, when the path began to narrow and grow steeper. The climb was demanding, but I was determined to push through. Sweat trickled down my back as I hiked up the jagged rocks, my boots crunching against the fallen leaves. My pack felt heavier with each step, but I welcomed the challenge. The quiet was almost deafening, the only sounds being my labored breaths and the occasional chirp of a distant bird. At some point, I noticed something odd, an unnatural silence. It was like the forest had suddenly decided to hold its breath. The birds had stopped singing, and the usual rustling of small creatures in the underbrush was absent. A slight unease crept over me, but I dismissed it. It was just the stillness of the woods, I told myself. Nothing to worry about. The trail curved sharply to the right, and I stopped to catch my breath at the bend. Looking ahead, I could see the path narrowing even more, winding between two tall rock faces that loomed like silent sentinels. There was something about the narrow pass that felt different, though I couldn't quite put my finger on it. It was just a feeling, a flicker of discomfort. I continued on, pressing forward, but the unsettling quiet weighed on me. I glanced around, half expecting to see someone behind me or ahead, but there was nothing. The path felt isolated now, as if the world outside had ceased to exist. I glanced at my phone to check the time, but there was no signal. It wasn't surprising. Most of the trail was in a dead zone, but it felt strange all the same. The further I went, the more I began to question my decision. This wasn't a heavily trafficked trail, but I had expected to come across at least one or two other hikers. Yet, there was no sign of anyone. The trail stretched ahead of me, empty and eerily quiet. I finally reached a clearing, a small plateau that gave me a panoramic view of the mountains below. It was breathtaking, the landscape sprawling out before me in layers of green and gold, with the peaks of distant mountains dusted with the last remnants of snow. I took a moment to sit on a large rock, removing my pack to rest. I closed my eyes for a moment, enjoying the solitude and the warmth of the sun on my face. But then I heard it, a noise from the trees, just a soft crack, like a branch snapping. I opened my eyes and scanned the treeline, but there was nothing. The sound hadn't been loud enough to be alarming, but it was enough to set my senses on edge. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just a squirrel or a bird, that I spent the next few minutes enjoying the view. But the feeling of being watched crept back into my mind. I stood up, slinging my pack over my shoulder, and began walking again, but the air had changed. It was heavier now, more oppressive. The trees seemed to close in around me, and the trail ahead was shadowed, even though the sun was still high in the sky. As I descended back into the forest, I noticed the trail becoming less defined, the yellow blazes harder to spot. It was as if the trail was intentionally disappearing. My heart rate picked up a little. I stopped to check my map, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I had followed the path carefully, but now it seemed as if the landscape itself was shifting, the trees growing thicker and the path more indistinct. At one point, I reached a fork in the trail. One path led down into a small ravine, while the other continued upward, twisting around the base of a rocky cliff. I checked my map again, but both routes seemed familiar. I chose the downward path, thinking it would be an easier descent. As I ventured deeper into the ravine, the temperature dropped. The trees here were larger, older, their trunks thick and gnarled, their branches heavy with moss. The light dimmed, as though the canopy above had thickened into an impenetrable blanket. It was strange, the way the woods had changed so abruptly, but I pressed on, eager to finish the hike before nightfall. Minutes turned into hours as I wandered deeper into the ravine, the path barely visible beneath a carpet of fallen leaves. I was starting to feel the weariness of the journey, my legs aching and my mind wandering. I hadn't expected to be this exhausted. The trail seemed to go on forever, winding in ways that felt unnatural, almost as if it were leading me in circles. I tried to stay calm, telling myself it was just the disorienting nature of the woods. But with every step, I felt more and more lost. Eventually, I came across something unexpected, an old cabin. It was small, dilapidated, with broken windows and a roof sagging under the weight of time. The sight of it sent a wave of relief through me. Maybe there was someone here, a ranger or a fellow hiker. I approached cautiously, half expecting to find it abandoned. As I reached the door, I froze. The air felt different here, heavier, as though the very earth beneath my feet was holding its breath. I could hear nothing. No birds, no wind, nothing but the pounding of my own heartbeat. My hand trembled as I reached for the door, but I didn't dare to open it. Something about the cabin felt wrong. I turned around and started to retrace my steps. The feeling of being watched had intensified, and now it was almost suffocating. I moved quickly, almost running, trying to get back to the main trail. The woods had become even more oppressive, the trees closing in tighter, blocking out the light. It was as if the forest itself was pushing me deeper into its depths. Minutes passed, but nothing looked familiar. The trail was gone, replaced by dense underbrush and tangled roots. My phone remained useless, no signal at all. My pulse quickened as panic began to set in. I had to find my way out. I forced myself to stay calm, to focus on finding a landmark, anything to guide me back. Then, just as I thought I might break down, I saw a familiar yellow blaze on a tree ahead. It was faint but visible, like a distant promise of safety. I hurried toward it, breathing a little easier now. The trail was still there, just hidden beneath the thickening foliage. I followed the trail for what felt like hours, constantly scanning the trees for any sign of human presence. But there was nothing, just the quiet, the shadows, and the path that seemed to stretch on forever. Finally, as the sun began to set, I reached the clearing at the edge of the forest. The sky was painted in streaks of pink and orange, and I could see the parking area in the distance. I had made it out. I don't know what happened back there, but I can't shake the feeling that the woods weren't just empty. Some presence had been with me. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks, or maybe it was something else. All I know is that I won't be hiking that trail again. The woods have a way of making you feel small, insignificant. And if there's one thing I've learned, it's that the forest has its own secrets. Some of them, it would be better if they stayed hidden. I've always loved hiking. The quiet, the solitude, the fresh air. It's the perfect way to escape everything. And so, on this particular autumn morning, I found myself alone on the South Ridge Trail, a less traveled path through a dense forest. It was a place I'd hiked before, but never alone. I had my backpack, filled with the usual essentials: water, snacks, a first aid kit, and a map, though I didn't expect to need it. The trail was well marked, even if it wasn't the most popular route. The air was crisp with the scent of damp earth and pine. The trees around me were mostly evergreens, their thick, dark green needles catching the sunlight in streaks, casting long shadows on the path ahead. A few scattered leaves from the maples and oaks were just beginning to turn yellow and orange, but there wasn't enough of a breeze to make them fall just yet. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. I made my way through the first few miles without issue, enjoying the rhythm of my steps crunching on the trail beneath me. Every now and then, I'd stop to take a sip of water or adjust the straps on my backpack. But the deeper I went into the forest, the more isolated everything felt. I hadn't seen another hiker since the trailhead, and the only sounds were the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant calls of birds. The further I went, the more the feeling of isolation began to gnaw at me. I was used to being alone in nature, but something about this place was different. The trees felt too close, as though they were leaning in, watching. I pushed the thought aside, chalking it up to my overactive imagination. It wasn't until the trail started to get steeper that I began to notice something strange. At first, I thought it was just the uneven ground beneath me, but then I realized there was an odd silence that settled over the forest. The birds had stopped calling, and the usual rustle of small animals moving through the underbrush had ceased. It was as though everything was holding its breath. I paused, standing still for a moment. I wasn't sure if I was hearing things, or if the air itself had changed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone anymore. I turned around, half expecting to see another hiker coming up the path behind me, but the trail was empty. It was just me, the trees, and the quiet. Shaking my head, I continued on. I wasn't going to let my imagination get the best of me. After all, it was just a hike, just another day in the woods. I pushed forward, the path narrowing as I ascended further into the hills. Hours seemed to pass, though I couldn't say for sure how long I'd been hiking. My legs were starting to feel the strain, and my water supply was getting low. The trail had become more rugged, with large rocks jutting out of the ground and thick roots twisting up from the earth, making each step more difficult. But I wasn't worried. I dealt with worse on other trails. Then I noticed it, a figure. Far ahead, just beyond a bend in the trail, I could make out a shape, a person, maybe, standing still like they were waiting for something. I paused, watching. They weren't moving. There was no way they could have heard me coming. I'd been making noise with each step, crunching on leaves and snapping twigs underfoot. And yet, this person stood perfectly still, as if they were aware of my presence. It made my skin crawl. I stood there for a long moment, unsure of what to do. Should I approach them? Was it another hiker? But something didn't sit right. I couldn't explain it, but everything about the situation felt wrong. I didn't like the idea of passing them on the narrow trail. The silence was oppressive now, and the air seemed to grow heavier, as though the forest itself had gone still in anticipation. Without thinking, I turned around, heading back the way I'd come. My heart was beating faster now, adrenaline starting to kick in. I didn't know why, but I felt a growing sense of urgency. Maybe it was because I was so deep in the woods and the figure was just standing there. Maybe it was the strange, unnatural silence. Whatever the reason, I wasn't going to stick around to find out. I moved quickly, but the forest didn't make it easy. Every step seemed to take longer than the last, and my legs were beginning to feel like lead. The trail, which had seemed so familiar on the way up, now felt foreign, as though the trees were shifting in place, trying to block my path. The sound of my own breathing was the only thing I could hear now, heavy and uneven. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see the figure following me, but there was nothing, just the dense, quiet woods stretching out behind me. I was alone, or at least I thought I was, but then the crunch of footsteps, just ahead of me, but not my own. I froze, heart racing. My breath caught in my throat as I strained to hear. There it was again, the unmistakable sound of someone moving on the trail ahead of me. I knew I couldn't be imagining it. The footsteps were real, and they were getting closer. I didn't stop to think. My instincts kicked in, and I broke into a sprint, my legs burning with the effort. The trail seemed to stretch on forever, twisting and turning, but all I could focus on was getting away from the sound of those footsteps, closing in behind me. The forest around me was a blur, the trees becoming indistinct shapes as I moved faster and faster, driven by pure panic. My breath was ragged, my chest tight, but I couldn't stop now. I had no idea who or what was back there, but I didn't want to find out. The trail dipped into a ravine, and I nearly lost my footing, stumbling down the uneven path. I caught myself just before I went tumbling, my heart in my throat. But as I regained my balance, I realized something. The footsteps had stopped. I skidded to a halt, panting heavily, and looked around. The ravine was quiet. The trail ahead of me was empty. The only sounds were my ragged breaths and the distant rustling of leaves in the wind. I didn't know what to make of it. Had I been hearing things? Had I imagined the footsteps? But the feeling of being watched, of being followed, was still there. The oppressive silence returned, and it felt as though the forest itself was holding its breath. I didn't want to stay here any longer. The air felt wrong. The whole forest felt wrong. But I also knew that turning back wasn't an option. I couldn't risk encountering whoever or whatever was out there. I had to keep moving. With renewed determination, I pushed forward. The trail finally began to flatten out, and the trees started to thin. I was almost out of the worst of it. The panic that had gripped me earlier began to ease, but only slightly. My mind was still racing, trying to make sense of what had happened. As I neared the end of the trail, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. The woods were still and quiet, and I could see the clearing ahead, the last stretch before the trailhead. I could already hear the distant sound of a creek, a reassuring, familiar noise. I was almost there, but then I saw something that made my blood run cold. The figure from earlier, the one I had seen from afar. They were standing at the edge of the clearing, just out of sight of the trailhead, watching, but this time they weren't standing still. They were moving toward me. I didn't hesitate. I turned and ran, adrenaline surging through me like a tidal wave. I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I reached the safety of the trailhead, where I collapsed onto a bench, gasping for air. I had no idea who or what had been out there with me in those woods, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't ever coming back. I never should have gone on that hike alone. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend. Just me, my boots, and the mountains. I had been planning it for weeks, thinking that some solitude in the wild would be the perfect escape from the stress of work and city life. I chose a trail that wasn't too well known, the kind of place where you could feel like you were the only person on Earth, the perfect way to recharge. The morning I left, the weather was clear, a bit chilly, but nothing out of the ordinary. The trailhead was just off the main road, and as I parked my car, I was met with the usual mix of excitement and nervousness that comes with starting something new. I checked my pack one more time, making sure I had everything: water, snacks, a first aid kit, a map. I knew the trail, at least the general layout of it, so I didn't expect to get lost. Still, I always like to be prepared. I locked the car and set off, breathing in the fresh, crisp air. The trail started out easy, winding through thick trees, their leaves already starting to turn amber for the fall. The air smelled earthy, like damp soil and pine. The only sounds were my footsteps crunching on the gravel path and the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. The first few miles were nothing unusual. The trail dipped down into a small valley, following a creek that twisted through the trees. It was quiet, with just the sound of water flowing over rocks and the occasional bird call overhead. I stopped a few times to take pictures, admiring the landscape, but each time I looked around, something seemed off. The woods felt dense, too dense. The trees crowded in on me, their gnarled branches reaching out as if trying to grab me. I shrugged it off, though. It was just my imagination, I thought. About halfway through the hike, the trail became steeper, leading up toward a rocky ridge. I had read that the view from the top was breathtaking, and that's what kept me going. My legs were starting to feel the burn, but I welcomed the physical challenge. I was in good shape, and this was exactly what I needed to clear my head. That's when I noticed something strange. I'd been walking for hours, and the trail was starting to feel unfamiliar. The path was narrowing, becoming more overgrown. The usual trail markers were sparse, and I started to wonder if I had missed a turn somewhere. I checked my map, but it didn't seem to match up with what I was seeing. The contours of the land were wrong. I couldn't figure it out. I stood there for a moment trying to get my bearings. The air around me seemed to grow heavier, the sounds of nature dimming as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I decided to press on, hoping the trail would open up again. But it didn't. It just got worse. The path became more and more difficult to follow, the ground uneven and slippery from the morning dew. I found myself scrambling over rocks and fallen branches, my heart rate picking up as the trail seemed to disappear entirely. At this point, I started to feel genuinely uneasy. It was as if the forest had closed in around me, trapping me in a maze with no way out. I should have turned back then. The thought crossed my mind, but something kept me going. Maybe it was the idea of the view at the top, maybe it was stubbornness, or maybe I just didn't want to admit that I had gotten myself into a situation I couldn't handle. I kept moving, pushing through the underbrush and ignoring the creeping sense of dread building in the pit of my stomach. The further I went, the more I felt like I was being watched. The trees seemed to loom over me, their twisted branches casting long, eerie shadows in the fading light. The air was thick, almost suffocating. It wasn't just the physical exhaustion anymore. There was something else, something wrong. Eventually, I found myself standing in front of a cliff, the rocks jutting out sharply toward the sky. It was a view, but not the one I had been expecting. The mountain peak was still out of reach, and the dense forest stretched endlessly behind me. The silence was oppressive, and it was as though the entire world had stopped. I looked around, trying to get a sense of where I was, but everything seemed unfamiliar. That's when I realized I had made a mistake. I'd taken the wrong path. Somehow, I had wandered off the main trail into an area that was rarely visited. I had no idea how far I had gone or where I was in relation to the trailhead. My phone had no signal, of course. I felt a wave of panic rush over me. This wasn't just a misturn or a minor detour. I was lost, and worse, I was alone. The sun was starting to dip below the horizon, casting everything in a cold, golden light. The woods felt different in the fading light, darker, more threatening. I knew I had to get out of there before it got completely dark, but the thought of retracing my steps felt impossible. The trail was barely visible now, and with every step I took, the dense forest seemed to swallow me whole. I started moving again, hoping to find some sign of the trail or any recognizable landmarks. But the more I walked, the more disoriented I became. I tried to remember my surroundings, any distinctive features of the landscape that might help me find my way back, but everything looked the same. Trees, rocks, more trees. Nothing stood out. I began to feel the weight of panic rising in my chest. My heart was pounding in my ears. I couldn't keep moving like this. I needed to stop and think. I found a small clearing and sat down on a rock, trying to steady my breathing. I pulled out my map again, but it was useless. I couldn't make sense of it anymore. It was as if the landscape itself had shifted, become something I didn't recognize. As the light faded, the forest grew darker, the shadows lengthening. The temperature dropped rapidly, and the chill of the night air sank into my bones. I realized I had to make a decision. Stay put and hope someone would come looking for me, or keep moving and risk getting even more lost. I opted for the latter. Felt like my only option. I picked a direction and forced myself to walk. The darkness pressed in on me like a weight, and I stumbled over roots and rocks in the growing gloom. Every crack of a twig, every rustle in the bushes made me jump. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It wasn't a ghost or some supernatural presence. It was just the primal instinct that tells you when you're being watched. Couldn't explain it, but I felt it deeply. And then, just when I thought I couldn't take another step, I saw it. A light. It was faint at first, just a small glow in the distance, but it was enough to give me hope. I hurried toward it, my legs burning, my breath shallow and fast. As I got closer, I realized it wasn't a campfire or someone else's flashlight. It was the last remnants of daylight, barely visible through a break in the trees. And just beyond that break, I saw the trail. A small sign, barely visible in the dim light, marked the turnoff to the main trail. I followed it without hesitation, my legs shaky but driven by the overwhelming need to get out of the woods. I kept my focus on the trail, ignoring the growing darkness around me, until finally, after what felt like hours, I made it back to the main path. Relief flooded through me, so intense that it almost brought me to my knees. I looked around, the familiar trees and rocks no longer feeling ominous but like old friends. I knew exactly where I was now. The end of the trail was just a few miles away. By the time I reached the trailhead, the stars were out, and the night air was crisp and cool. My car was waiting for me, a beacon of safety. I didn't hesitate. I didn't look back. I just got in, started the engine, and drove off without another thought. I don't know what exactly happened out there, but I know I'll never go hiking alone again. It was a harsh reminder of how quickly things can go wrong, how easily you can become lost in a place that's supposed to be peaceful. That forest isn't some tranquil escape. It's a place that can swallow you whole if you're not careful. And as I drove away, one thought kept repeating in my head: I was lucky. Next time, I might not be. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend getaway. Just me, a small cabin in the woods, and the sound of nature. That's all I wanted. I've always been the type of person who craves quiet, away from the noise of the city, away from distractions, away from everything. Just solitude. I found the cabin online. The listing was simple: a rustic log cabin, tucked deep in a secluded forest, an hour's drive from the nearest town. The pictures showed a small, cozy space surrounded by trees, with a wide front porch and a view of a small lake. The kind of place where you could just sit and lose yourself in nature for a few days. No neighbors for miles, no one to bother me. The price was good, and the place seemed perfect. I had my bags packed, my books ready, and I couldn't wait to get there. When I arrived, it was exactly what I expected, maybe even better. The cabin stood alone at the edge of a clearing, surrounded by tall pines. It looked like it had been here for a long time. Its wood darkened by time, but it still had a charm to it. I could feel the stress from the week begin to melt away as I stepped out of my car. The air was crisp and fresh, the scent of pine filling my lungs. The sun was setting behind the trees, casting a warm glow on everything. The inside of the cabin was just as inviting. A stone fireplace on one wall, a small kitchen tucked into the corner, and a loft bedroom that overlooked the main living area. There was a rustic charm to it all: wooden beams overhead, mismatched furniture, an old armchair by the fire. I immediately felt at home. I unloaded my things and lit a fire, then sat down with a book on the couch. The wind outside began to pick up, rustling the branches of the trees, but it was a comforting sound, like nature itself was whispering around me. I spent the evening reading, drinking a cup of tea, and enjoying the quiet. When night fell, I went to bed, content. The bed was firm but comfortable, the kind of mattress that made you feel like you were sleeping on a cloud. The only sound was the crackling of the fire, and it lulled me to sleep. But when I woke up the next morning, something felt off. The air felt thicker, heavier somehow, and the wind had died down completely. It was eerily still, almost too still. I shook it off, figuring it was just my imagination. Maybe the weather was changing, or maybe it was just the isolation. I went about my morning, making coffee and staring out at the lake. The water was calm. The reflection of the trees mirrored perfectly on the surface. I didn't think much of it at the time, but there was a feeling in the pit of my stomach, something that told me I wasn't alone in the woods anymore. It was subtle, something that lurked just beyond my awareness, but it was there. Later in the afternoon, I decided to go for a walk around the property, just to explore. The cabin was built on a decent amount of land, and I could see the trail leading down to a small creek in the distance. As I walked through the woods, I kept looking over my shoulder. I told myself it was just my imagination, but the feeling of being watched wouldn't go away. Every time I stopped and listened, there was nothing. No birds, no squirrels, no rustling of leaves, just the sound of my footsteps and my breathing. I kept going, my eyes darting between the trees. The trail was narrow, overgrown with thick brush in some places, and the further I went, the more oppressive the woods seemed. I found myself wishing I had brought a map or at least some kind of guide, but I had no intention of getting lost. I had a phone with me, and I told myself I would just walk to the creek, take a few photos, and head back. But when I got to the creek, I saw something strange. At first, I thought it was just an old log, half submerged in the water, but as I got closer, I saw that it was something else. Something that didn't belong in the water. It was a bundle of twigs and branches, tied together with what looked like old rope, and it was floating just above the surface, bobbing gently in the current. I knelt down to get a better look. My curiosity piqued. There was something about it that felt wrong. The way it was arranged, it didn't look natural. As I reached out to touch it, I heard a crack behind me. I spun around, heart racing. Nothing, just the trees still as ever. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I ignored it and turned back to the bundle. My fingers brushed against the twigs, and for a moment, I thought I felt something warm. Then, just as quickly, the warmth faded. I pulled my hand back, feeling uneasy. I wanted to get back to the cabin, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I took a deep breath, stood up, and turned to walk back. But as I did, something caught my eye: movement. Through the trees, just a flash of something white. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I could see nothing, but the feeling in the air had changed. It was no longer still and quiet. It was tense, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I started walking faster, my footsteps growing louder in the silence. When I finally made it back to the clearing, I almost ran to the cabin. The door was still locked, the windows still closed. Everything seemed fine, but that uneasy feeling lingered. I spent the rest of the day indoors, trying to shake off the feeling that something was wrong. The hours passed slowly, the wind picking up again as the evening approached. I tried to settle in, but the isolation felt different now, more oppressive. The night seemed to stretch on endlessly. That's when I noticed something I hadn't before. Footprints, fresh ones, leading up to the door of the cabin. I stood frozen, staring at the marks in the dirt, my heart racing. The prints were large, deep, and they didn't look like animal tracks. They were human. I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to leave, but I also didn't want to stay. My phone had no service, and I didn't have any way of contacting anyone. I tried to convince myself it was some kind of prank, maybe someone else in the area, but deep down I knew that wasn't true. There was no one around for miles. I checked the windows again, making sure they were locked, then pulled the curtains tight. The whole cabin felt too small, too confined. I tried to sit down, to breathe, but the walls felt like they were closing in. The night passed in a blur of anxiety. I don't remember falling asleep, but I woke up to a soft noise in the middle of the night. It was faint, like a scratching sound, coming from the back of the cabin. I held my breath, straining to hear. The sound stopped, then started again. Scratching, dragging, almost like something was moving along the wall. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. I just lay there, wide awake, my heart hammering in my chest. The noise continued for what felt like hours, but I couldn't bring myself to look outside. The thought of what I might see, what might be out there, kept me frozen under the covers. By morning, the noise had stopped. I wanted to leave, but the road back to town would be another hour, and I didn't want to face whatever was out there. I decided to pack my things and head out as soon as I could. But as I opened the door to the cabin, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The footprints from the night before were still there, but they weren't the only ones. There were new tracks, fresh ones, leading away from the cabin, deeper into the woods. I took one last look at the cabin, then grabbed my things and ran. I didn't stop until I reached my car, and as I pulled away, I glanced back at the cabin one last time. The trees were still, the wind had died down again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was still out there. The crunch of gravel under my boots was the only sound breaking the stillness as I made my way deeper into the forest. The trail had been quiet for hours with no sign of other hikers. That was exactly what I wanted. Isolation, peace, and the chance to clear my head. Life back in the city had been relentless lately, and this solo camping trip was my escape. My backpack felt heavy, even though I'd packed light: a tent, sleeping bag, some freeze-dried meals, water purification tablets, a knife, and a first aid kit. I'd hiked this trail once before, years ago, but only for a day trip. This time, I planned to spend 2 nights out here. I'd scoured maps and online forums to pick a spot far off the main trail where I'd be unlikely to run into anyone else. By late afternoon, I reached the area I'd marked on my map. The trees here were dense, their tall trunks forming a canopy that let through only scattered shafts of sunlight. The air was cool and smelled of pine and damp earth. I found a small clearing near a stream, a perfect spot to set up camp. The stream was narrow but flowed steadily, its water crystal clear. It would be my source for drinking water and cooking. I pitched my tent quickly, practiced from years of weekend camping trips. The ground was soft but dry, and I secured the stakes firmly. I gathered some rocks to create a fire pit, then collected dry wood and kindling from the forest floor. By the time I had everything ready, the sun was starting to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Dinner was simple: a freeze-dried pasta meal rehydrated with boiling water. I ate it by the small fire I'd built, listening to the soft gurgle of the stream and the occasional rustle of leaves. As darkness settled in, the forest around me came alive with the sounds of insects and the distant calls of nocturnal animals. I felt a deep sense of calm, the kind that only comes from being far away from the noise and chaos of civilization. After cleaning up and securing my food in a bear-proof bag hung high in a tree, I crawled into my tent. The thin nylon walls felt flimsy against the vastness of the wilderness, but they were enough to keep out the bugs and the chill. I zipped myself into my sleeping bag, the weight of the day's hike pulling me into sleep almost immediately. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night. At first, I wasn't sure what had roused me. The forest was pitch black, the kind of darkness that makes you feel like you're floating in a void. My watch read 2:13 a.m. I lay still, straining to hear something over the pounding of my heart. It was then that I noticed the absence of the usual forest sounds. The insects had gone silent, and even the stream seemed quieter than before. I told myself it was nothing. Animals move through the forest at night, and their presence can cause other creatures to go quiet. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. My instincts, honed by years of camping, were telling me to stay alert. Eventually, the sounds of the forest returned, and I managed to drift back to sleep. When I woke again, it was dawn. The air was cold and crisp, and a light mist hung over the ground. I shook off the unease from the night before, chalking it up to an overactive imagination. After breakfast, I decided to explore the area. I left most of my gear at the campsite, carrying only a day pack with water, snacks, and my knife. The forest here was beautiful, with towering trees and patches of sunlight filtering through the canopy. I followed the stream upstream, stopping occasionally to admire the scenery or take a sip of water. About an hour into my hike, I came across something unexpected. It was a shoe, muddy and partially buried in the soft ground near the stream. It looked old, the kind of heavy-duty hiking boot you'd expect an experienced outdoorsman to wear. I picked it up, turning it over in my hands. The sole was worn, and the laces were frayed. There was no sign of its owner. I looked around, but there was nothing else nearby. No bag, no clothing, no other footprints in the mud. It was strange. but I figured someone might have lost it while crossing the stream or moving through the area. I left the shoe where I found it and continued on. As the day went on, I couldn't shake a growing sense of unease. I kept feeling like I was being watched, though every time I turned around, there was nothing but trees and shadows. By the time I made it back to my campsite, the sun was already low in the sky. That evening, I built another fire and tried to relax, but my nerves were on edge. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig seemed amplified, my imagination conjuring images of predators or something worse. I reminded myself that I was alone out here, that there was nothing to fear but my own thoughts. I went to bed early, hoping sleep would come quickly. Instead, I lay awake for hours, my ears tuned to every sound. At some point, I must have drifted off because I woke with a start to the sound of something outside my tent. It was faint at first, a soft crunching, like footsteps on dry leaves. My heart raced as I lay completely still, straining to hear more. The sound grew louder, closer. It wasn't the random rustling of an animal. It was deliberate, rhythmic. Someone was walking around my campsite. I reached for my knife, gripping it tightly. My mind raced with possibilities. Another hiker? A hunter? Someone who had no business being out here? I waited, every muscle in my body tense. The footsteps stopped just outside my tent. Then silence. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. I didn't dare move or make a sound. Finally, I heard the footsteps again, this time moving away. I waited until I was sure they were gone before unzipping the tent just enough to peek out. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a dim glow over the clearing. There was no one in sight. The rest of the night was a blur of fear and exhaustion. I didn't sleep, keeping my knife close and my ears tuned to every sound. When dawn finally broke, I packed up my camp as quickly as I could. I didn't even stop to make breakfast. As I hiked back toward the trailhead, I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me. But the forest remained empty, the only sounds the crunch of my boots and the occasional call of a bird. When I finally reached my car, I felt a wave of relief so strong it almost brought me to tears. I never found out who or what was outside my tent that night. Maybe it was another camper, though the thought of someone wandering around my campsite in the middle of the night without announcing themselves is unsettling. Maybe it was just an animal, though the deliberate footsteps suggested otherwise. Whatever it was, it reminded me of something important. The wilderness is unpredictable. It's beautiful and serene, but it's also indifferent. Out there, you're vulnerable in a way you rarely feel in everyday life. I still love camping, but now I'm more cautious. I double-check my gear, choose campsites closer to established trails, and always trust my instincts. The forest may be peaceful, but it's never entirely safe. It was a spur-of-the-moment decision to go camping. After weeks of work, stress, and staring at screens, I needed the quiet of the woods. Just me, a tent, and the sounds of nature. The idea was simple: escape for a weekend, reset my mind, and return feeling refreshed. I'd been camping before, so I didn't think much about the details. I packed the basics: a tent, sleeping bag, some canned food, a flashlight, a first aid kit, and a knife, and drove out early Saturday morning to a state forest I'd heard about but never explored. The trailhead was empty when I arrived. I wasn't surprised. It was mid-October, and the temperature had dropped enough to deter casual campers. I liked it that way. Fewer people meant more solitude. The air was crisp, the trees shedding the last of their autumn leaves. The ground scattered with reds, yellows, and browns. I strapped on my pack, locked my car, and started hiking. The trail wound through the forest, uneven but well marked. It was about 6 miles to the clearing I'd chosen for my campsite, a small spot beside a creek I'd found on a map. The hike in was uneventful. The forest was quiet, save for the occasional rustle of squirrels or the distant call of birds. I passed a few abandoned fire pits and old campsites but saw no one else. By the time I reached the clearing, the sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows through the trees. The clearing was perfect. The creek ran clear and cold, bubbling over smooth rocks. The ground was flat, and there was enough space to set up my tent without being too exposed. I pitched the tent quickly, gathering some fallen branches and rocks to make a small fire pit. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, I had a modest fire going, the warmth pushing back the evening chill. Dinner was simple: a can of chili heated over the flames and a couple of granola bars. After eating, I leaned back against a log, staring up at the sky. Without city lights, the stars were brighter than I'd seen in years. The Milky Way stretched across the darkness, and for the first time in a while, I felt at peace. It was around midnight when I decided to call it a night. The fire had died down to embers, and the temperature had dropped significantly. I crawled into my tent, zipped up my sleeping bag, and closed my eyes. The sounds of the creek and the faint rustling of leaves lulled me to sleep. I don't know what woke me. One moment I was asleep, and the next, I was wide awake, heart pounding in the silence. At first, I thought it was just the unfamiliarity of being alone in the woods, but then I heard it, a faint crunching sound, like footsteps on dry leaves. I froze, straining to hear. The sound came again, closer this time. Someone or something was moving outside my tent. My first thought was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but the steps were too deliberate, too heavy. I reached for my flashlight, careful not to make any noise, and turned it on. The beam illuminated the inside of the tent, but I couldn't see anything outside. The footsteps stopped. I sat there, holding my breath, listening. Minutes passed, and the forest was silent again. Telling myself it was nothing, I eventually lay back down, though sleep didn't come easily. Every rustle, every crack of a twig, set my nerves on edge. By the time dawn broke, I was exhausted. The next morning, I stepped outside to find the campsite as I'd left it, or so I thought. Near the edge of the clearing, the ground was disturbed. The leaves had been kicked aside, revealing patches of dirt. Could have been an animal, but the pattern looked too much like footprints. I told myself I was imagining things, that I was just tired. Still, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. I spent the day exploring the area, trying to distract myself. I followed the creek upstream, climbed a small ridge for a better view, and took pictures of the autumn foliage. By the time I returned to camp, the sun was setting again. I built another fire, cooked dinner, and tried to relax. The woods felt different that night, though. The quiet was heavier, the darkness deeper. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone standing at the edge of the firelight. Around midnight, I went to bed, leaving the knife within easy reach. This time, I fell asleep quickly, the exhaustion from the night before catching up with me. But once again, I woke in the middle of the night. This time, the sound wasn't footsteps. It was a low, distant noise, like something scraping against wood. Stopped, then started again, closer. I sat up, heart racing, and grabbed the flashlight. The sound stopped as soon as I turned it on. I waited, listening, but the woods were silent. Gathering my courage, I unzipped the tent and shone the beam outside. The clearing was empty, the trees casting long shadows under the moonlight. But something caught my eye. A fresh scratch on the tree closest to my tent, the bark gouged as if by a knife or a claw. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. When the first light of dawn appeared, I decided to pack up and leave. The unease I'd felt since the first night had grown into something I couldn't ignore. I told myself it was paranoia, that I was overreacting, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. As I hiked back to the trailhead, I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me. The forest seemed quieter than before, the usual sounds of birds and squirrels absent. When I finally reached my car, relief washed over me. I tossed my pack in the trunk, climbed in, and locked the doors. Driving away, I couldn't help but glance in the rearview mirror. The forest receded into the distance, the trees standing silent and still. I never saw anyone, never heard anything concrete, but the feeling stayed with me. Even now, back in the comfort of my home, I can't shake the memory of those nights. The footsteps, the scratches, the oppressive silence. It all lingers, a reminder that sometimes the scariest things are the ones we can't explain. The sun was starting to dip behind the ridge, casting long shadows across the rugged trail. I had been hiking for hours now, and as much as I loved the solitude, I could feel the weight of the wilderness pressing in on me. It was a different kind of quiet out here, a kind of silence that didn't just mean nothing was making noise, but that the land itself was holding its breath, waiting. I had come here to clear my mind, to get away from everything. The stress of daily life had built up over the months, and the noise of city living was getting to me. This trail, remote, far from the beaten path, seemed like the perfect escape. It wasn't one of those tourist-friendly hikes where you're constantly bumping into people. No, this was a less traveled route, one known only to those who were truly comfortable with nature. I was prepared for this. I had the right gear, enough food and water, a map of the area, and a healthy respect for the wilderness. Still, despite all that, as I walked deeper into the woods, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The trail had started out easy enough, a well-marked path winding through thick trees and bushes. But as the hours passed, it became narrower, more difficult to follow, and the dense forest seemed to close in on me. The air was thick, sticky with humidity, and the smell of moss and damp earth mixed with the faint scent of pine. There were no other hikers around, no sign of any wildlife either. It felt strange, like nature itself had been put on mute. I checked my watch. It was almost 7 p.m. now. I knew I needed to start thinking about setting up camp, but the idea of stopping didn't sit right with me. I wanted to keep going, to push forward. But as I glanced up at the sky, I saw a sliver of the moon, hidden behind the trees. The light was starting to fade. I decided to find a good spot to camp before nightfall. There was a small clearing ahead, just beyond a thick thicket of ferns. It seemed like a perfect spot to pitch my tent and settle down for the night. As I walked toward it, the forest seemed to become unnervingly quiet. The usual chirp of insects had stopped, and even the wind had died down. Everything felt still, like the world had frozen in time. I set up my tent quickly, trying not to waste too much time. The rustle of the fabric as I moved was oddly loud in the heavy silence. But soon enough, my campsite was ready. I pulled out my stove, heated up some water, and made a simple meal. The warmth of the food was comforting, but my mind kept drifting back to the strange stillness surrounding me. I hadn't seen any animals at all, not even birds, which was rare for this part of the woods. No rustling in the underbrush, no movement at all. After dinner, I decided to walk around the clearing, hoping to shake off the weird sense of unease that had settled over me. The trees stood like sentinels around the open space, their branches creaking softly in the still air. I stood there for a long time, just listening. But the more I listened, the more I began to realize that something wasn't right. There should have been more sounds. Animals moving through the underbrush, the distant call of a bird, the buzz of insects. But it was as if the forest itself had gone silent, holding its breath. My unease grew into something else, something darker. It was the kind of feeling you get when you know you're being watched, even though you can't see anyone. I told myself I was being paranoid, that it was just the quiet of the wilderness getting to me. But I couldn't shake the feeling. I wasn't alone out here. I returned to my tent and zipped it up tight. I double-checked that everything was secure. My flashlight, my phone, my knife, before crawling into my sleeping bag. The wind had picked up slightly, causing the trees to sway gently, but still, there was no other sound.
No wildlife, no buzzing insects.
Just the wind and the rustling of leaves. I tried to sleep, but the sense of unease kept me awake. Every creak of the tent, every snap of a twig in the distance made my heart race. I kept telling myself it was just the woods, that I was fine, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Finally, I drifted off into a light, restless sleep. I woke up to the sound of something outside my tent. A faint noise, just a brush of movement against the earth. It was so subtle, I wasn't sure if I'd imagined it. But then it came again, something moving in the underbrush. I lay still, listening, my breath catching in my throat. The noise was close, far too close for comfort. I grabbed my flashlight, flicking it on. The beam cut through the darkness, but I couldn't see anything. There was nothing out there. I waited for a few more seconds, straining to hear, but the forest was silent once again. Maybe it was an animal, maybe a deer or something small, but that didn't explain why my heart was pounding in my chest. I stayed up the rest of the night, listening to every sound, too nervous to sleep. As the first light of dawn crept through the trees, I packed up quickly, eager to leave the clearing. The sun was rising, and the sky had that soft blue glow to it, but I couldn't shake the strange feeling that had settled into my bones. Something was off about this place. I retraced my steps along the trail, trying to push the thought of the previous night from my mind. The path was more recognizable in the daylight, but the deeper I went into the woods, the more uncomfortable I became. The air was thick, and the sounds of the forest felt muffled, like the trees themselves were hiding something. Then I saw it, a figure standing just off the trail. It was a person, but they were too still, too quiet. I stopped, my heart skipping a beat. I stared at the figure, my mind racing. Was it a hiker? A lost traveler? It was hard to tell from the distance, but I had a bad feeling. I should have called out, tried to engage, but something told me not to. Something told me to keep walking. I turned away quickly, picking up my pace. But as I walked faster, the feeling of being watched returned, stronger this time. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and my breath came in short bursts. I didn't dare look back. I kept walking, telling myself that it was just my imagination, that I was being irrational. The feeling didn't go away. The woods seemed to press in on me, the trees too close, the air too thick. Every time I looked over my shoulder, there was nothing there, just the forest stretching endlessly in every direction. But that nagging sense of being watched didn't let up. I kept walking, my legs aching, my mind racing. How far was I from the trailhead? How much longer would this last? The sunlight filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the path, but I couldn't shake the sense that something was wrong. It wasn't just the silence anymore. It was the way everything felt. Too still, too unnatural. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, I saw the clearing ahead. The familiar rocks, the sign marking the start of the trail. I wasn't out of the woods yet, but I was close. I could hear the hum of distant traffic, the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze, and for the first time in hours, I could breathe again. The weight in my chest lifted, and I finally let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding. I made it back to my car and drove away as fast as I could. It wasn't until I was halfway home that I realized I hadn't even looked at the map again to check my route. I didn't need to. I was out, safe. The woods, the trail, the feeling that had gnawed at me all night. It was all behind me now. But as I reached home and unloaded my gear, I found something odd in my pack. A small, folded note. I didn't remember putting it there. I unfolded it carefully, my hands shaking as I read the simple message. Asterisk, we see you. Asterisk, I threw the note in the trash and took a long, hard look at the wilderness that had felt so safe just a day before. What had happened out there? Was it just my mind playing tricks on me? Or was there something more? The answer, I realized, didn't matter, because some things are better left unexplored. The air was crisp and cold that morning, a sharp bite that left my fingers tingling as I adjusted the straps of my backpack. I was deep in the Rockies, far from any town or trailhead. I'd been planning this hike for weeks, poring over maps, reading weather forecasts, and preparing for every possibility. I'd even triple-checked my gear the night before, a habit I'd developed after years of solo hiking. The trailhead was nothing more than a dirt pull-off with a faded wooden sign, barely legible from years of exposure to the elements. It suited me perfectly. I wasn't looking for crowded trails or the chatter of other hikers. I'd come here for the solitude and the challenge. The sun was just beginning to rise as I started, casting long shadows through the forest. The trail wound its way uphill, a narrow dirt path flanked by towering pines and the occasional patch of aspen. The forest was alive with sound, the rustling of leaves, the chirping of birds, and the occasional scurry of something small darting through the underbrush. I kept a steady pace, my boots crunching against the dirt and gravel. The rhythm was comforting, almost meditative. The first couple of miles were uneventful, just me and the wilderness. I passed a small creek and paused to refill my water bottle, the icy water stinging my hands. I checked my map, noting a series of switchbacks ahead that would lead me to a ridge with a panoramic view of the valley below. The climb was steep, and I felt the burn in my legs as I ascended. The air grew thinner, and my breaths came quicker, but the effort was worth it. When I reached the ridge, the view was breathtaking. The valley stretched out before me, a patchwork of greens and browns dotted with the occasional shimmer of a distant lake. Snow-capped peaks rose in the distance, their jagged edges piercing the sky. I stood there for a while, letting the wind cool my sweat and taking in the beauty around me. It was moments like these that made all the planning and effort worthwhile. I snapped a few photos and checked my GPS. The next leg of the trail would take me down into the valley, where I planned to set up camp for the night near a remote lake. As I descended, the trail became less defined. It was clear that not many people ventured this far. Fallen trees blocked the path in places, and I had to bushwhack around them. The forest grew denser, the trees pressing in on either side. The sunlight barely penetrated the canopy, casting everything in a dim, greenish light. It was in this section of the trail that I first noticed something was off. At first, it was subtle, a sense of unease that I couldn't quite place. The forest had grown eerily quiet. The birdsong that had accompanied me earlier was gone, replaced by a heavy silence. Even the wind seemed to have stilled. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination running wild. But as I continued, the feeling grew stronger. I'd been hiking long enough to trust my instincts, and they were screaming at me that something wasn't right. I stopped and scanned the area, turning slowly to take in my surroundings. The forest looked the same as it had a few minutes ago. Tall trees, dense underbrush, and patches of sunlight filtering through the leaves. But there was something about it that felt wrong. It was as if the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I decided to keep moving. Standing still wouldn't help, and I still had several miles to go before I reached the lake. I quickened my pace, my eyes darting to every shadow and movement. That's when I saw it. A flash of color in the underbrush, something that didn't belong. I froze, my heart pounding. It took me a moment to realize what I was looking at. A piece of fabric caught on a branch. It was bright blue, the kind of synthetic material used in hiking gear. I moved closer, my curiosity outweighing my fear. The fabric was torn, frayed at the edges as if it had been ripped violently. Nearby, I spotted more. A scrap of nylon, part of a strap, and what looked like a piece of a sleeping bag. Panic began to creep in. Someone else had been here, and judging by the condition of the gear, something had gone very wrong. I looked around again, my senses on high alert. The forest was still silent, the oppressive quiet making my skin crawl. I debated what to do. Turning back would mean retracing several miles, and I wasn't sure I had enough daylight left to make it to the trailhead. Going forward felt equally risky, but at least it would bring me closer to my planned campsite and, eventually, to safety. I decided to press on, keeping an eye out for any more signs of trouble. The trail grew even less distinct, forcing me to rely on my map and GPS to navigate. I found more pieces of gear along the way: a water bottle, a torn jacket, and, most disturbingly, a boot. It was upright, as if someone had just stepped out of it, but there was no sign of its owner. By the time I reached the lake, the sun was low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the water. The lake was beautiful, its surface smooth as glass, reflecting the surrounding trees and mountains. But the sight did little to calm my nerves. The sense of unease was stronger than ever, an almost tangible weight pressing down on me. I set up my tent quickly, my hands shaking as I worked. I'd camped alone countless times before, but I'd never felt like this. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone, or something, emerge from the trees. As darkness fell, I built a small fire and ate a quick meal. The warmth and light were comforting, but they didn't erase the feeling that I was being watched. I kept my bear spray within arm's reach and my knife clipped to my belt. The night was long and restless. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves set my heart racing. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, and uncomfortably close. I held my breath, clutching my knife, but the sound faded, leaving me alone in the oppressive silence. Morning couldn't come fast enough. When the first light of dawn filtered through the trees, I packed up my gear in record time. I was determined to get out of there and back to the safety of my car. The hike back was grueling. I stuck to the trail as best I could, but the forest seemed different in the morning light. It was disorienting, and I found myself checking my GPS more frequently than I'd like. The sense of unease hadn't abated. If anything, it had grown stronger. About halfway back to the trailhead, I came across something that stopped me in my tracks. A clearing in the forest, littered with debris. There were scraps of fabric, pieces of gear, and bones, small ones, scattered among the leaves. I couldn't tell what kind of animal they belonged to, but the sight was enough to send me into a full-blown panic. I forced myself to keep moving, my pace quickening with every step. I didn't stop to rest, didn't pause to eat or drink. All I wanted was to get out of that forest. When I finally reached the trailhead, I almost cried with relief. My car was exactly where I'd left it, a reassuring sight after the ordeal I'd just been through. I threw my gear into the back seat and started the engine, the sound of the motor a welcome reminder of civilization. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd narrowly escaped something terrible. I still don't know what happened in that forest, or what became of the person who'd left their gear behind. But one thing is certain. I'll never forget the way it felt, standing alone in the wilderness, with the weight of an unseen presence pressing down on me. I haven't been back to that trail since, and I'm not sure I ever will. The weather was perfect that morning. Clear skies, a light breeze, and just a hint of chill in the air that made it feel refreshing. I had planned this hike for weeks, meticulously mapping the route and checking trail reports. It was supposed to be a moderately challenging loop, about 12 miles long, winding through the foothills of a remote mountain range. I'd packed everything I needed: water, snacks, a first aid kit, a map, and my trusty compass. My boots were broken in, my backpack felt light, and I was eager to get started. The first few miles were uneventful, just the crunch of gravel underfoot and the occasional chirp of a bird. The trail snaked through a dense forest of pines, their needles carpeting the ground in a soft layer. Sunlight filtered through the trees in scattered patches, and the air smelled of earth and sap. I felt invigorated, my body settling into a rhythm as I climbed higher and higher. Every now and then, I stopped to take a sip of water and admire the view. About 4 miles in, the trail began to change. The forest thinned out, giving way to rocky terrain and scrubby bushes. The incline grew steeper, and I had to use my hands to steady myself on some of the more uneven sections. Still, it was nothing I couldn't handle. The solitude was part of the appeal. I hadn't seen another hiker all day, and the silence was calming. Around the 6-mile mark, I reached the highest point of the trail, a rocky outcrop that offered a panoramic view of the valley below. I sat down to rest, pulling out an energy bar and letting my legs dangle over the edge. The wind was stronger up here, whipping my hair around and carrying the faint scent of wildflowers. I could see for miles. Rolling hills, distant peaks, and a thin ribbon of river cutting through the landscape. It was breathtaking, but as I sat there, I noticed something odd. To my right, maybe a 1/4 mile away, there was a small clearing in the brush. At first, it looked like any other patch of open ground, but then I realized there was something in the middle of it. A structure, maybe. It was hard to tell from this distance, but it looked out of place. I pulled out my binoculars to get a better look. It was definitely a structure, a small, weathered shack, leaning slightly to one side as if it had been abandoned for years. There were no trails leading to it that I could see, and it wasn't marked on my map. Curiosity tugged at me. It was probably just an old hunting cabin, but something about it seemed off. The logical part of me said to stick to the trail and not waste time exploring, but another part, the part that craved adventure, urged me to check it out. I decided to go for it. The clearing was only slightly off my planned route, and I could easily navigate back to the trail. I started down the slope, the loose rocks making the descent trickier than I'd anticipated. The closer I got, the more I realized just how dilapidated the shack was. The roof sagged in the middle, and the wooden walls were weathered to a dull gray. A single window, its glass long gone, gaped like an empty eye socket. When I reached the clearing, the air felt different, heavier, almost. I chalked it up to nerves and stepped closer. The door was barely hanging on its hinges, creaking slightly in the wind. I pushed it open, and it swung inward with a groan. The interior was dark, but enough sunlight streamed through the cracks in the walls to illuminate the space. The shack was empty except for a few rotted wooden crates and a rusted metal bed frame. The floor was dirt, packed down and littered with debris, leaves, twigs, and what looked like animal bones. A strange smell lingered in the air, faint but unpleasant, like something damp and decaying. I felt a shiver run down my spine. I told myself there was nothing here, just an old, forgotten cabin. But then my eyes caught something on the far wall. Scratches, dozens of them, etched into the wood in uneven lines. They didn't look like claw marks. They were too deliberate, too precise. I stepped closer to get a better look, and that's when I noticed the numbers. Each line had a number scratched beside it, like someone had been keeping a tally. The realization sent a jolt of unease through me. What kind of person or thing had spent enough time here to do this? And why? I backed away, my heart pounding, and nearly tripped over one of the crates. It shifted slightly, revealing something underneath. Against my better judgment, I crouched down and lifted the crate. It was a backpack, covered in dirt and mildew. I picked it up carefully, noting its faded color and frayed straps. Inside, I found a few items: a water bottle, a notebook, and a set of keys. The notebook was damp and the pages stuck together, but I managed to peel one open. The handwriting was messy, the ink smudged, but I could make out a few words: lost, wrong turn, help. I didn't need to read any more. My stomach churned as I shoved the notebook back into the backpack and stood up. Whoever had written that had been in trouble. Had they made it out? Or were they still out here somewhere, their fate sealed by this unforgiving wilderness? I hurried out of the shack, the unease growing with every step. The clearing felt oppressive now, the trees around it looming like silent sentinels. I tried to retrace my path back to the trail, but the terrain looked different. The rocks and bushes all seemed unfamiliar, and I realized with a sinking feeling that I was turned around. I pulled out my compass, trying to calm the rising panic. I knew the general direction of the trail and started walking, keeping an eye on the needle. The forest seemed denser now, the trees pressing in closer. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig set my nerves on edge. I told myself it was just the wind, or maybe a squirrel, but the feeling of being watched wouldn't go away. Minutes turned into hours as I trudged through the wilderness, my legs growing heavier with every step. The sun was dipping lower in the sky, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly. I knew I had to find the trail before nightfall. I'd brought a headlamp, but the idea of navigating in the dark was terrifying. Just as the first hints of twilight began to creep in, I stumbled onto a faint path. Relief flooded through me as I realized it had to connect to the main trail. I followed it, my pace quickening despite my exhaustion. The path twisted and turned, but eventually, I saw the familiar marker of the main trail ahead. When I finally made it back to my car, the sun had dipped below the horizon, and the sky was awash with deep blues and purples. I tossed my backpack into the passenger seat and sank into the driver's seat, my body aching and my mind racing. I'd made it out, but the questions lingered. Who had built that shack? Who had left that backpack? And what had happened to them? As I drove away, the weight of the day began to lift, replaced by a deep gratitude for having made it back safely. The wilderness was beautiful, but it was also unforgiving. It reminded me that preparation and respect for nature were crucial, and that sometimes curiosity could lead you down paths better left unexplored. It was the kind of cabin you picture in the middle of nowhere, old, weathered, and isolated. I had driven out to spend the weekend alone, needing a break from the endless buzz of the city and the monotony of daily life. The cabin belonged to a friend's uncle, who hadn't used it in years. It had no internet, no cell service, and no neighbors for miles. Perfect, I thought. Just me, nature, and some time to clear my head. The gravel road leading to the cabin was rough, winding through dense forest. The trees were tall, their branches intertwining overhead to form a kind of natural tunnel. By the time I reached the clearing where the cabin sat, the late afternoon sun was casting long shadows, making everything look a little darker than it should have. I parked my car, grabbed my bags, and walked up the creaking steps to the front door. The key was under the mat, just as my friend had said it would be. The inside was simple: a small kitchen, a living room with a worn-out couch and a stone fireplace, and a single bedroom at the back. Everything smelled faintly of damp wood and dust. I set my bags down and started unpacking, placing a few groceries in the fridge and tossing my jacket on the back of a chair. There was a stack of firewood by the fireplace, so I figured I'd get a fire going later. For now, I just wanted to settle in. By the time I had everything sorted, the sun was dipping below the horizon. The air outside was cooling rapidly, and the sounds of the forest were growing louder: crickets, the occasional rustle of leaves, and the distant hoot of an owl. I stepped outside to take it all in. The sky was clear, and the stars were starting to come out. It was peaceful, exactly what I'd hoped for. After a quick dinner of canned soup and crackers, I decided to build that fire. It took a few tries to get it going, but soon the flames were crackling and filling the room with a warm, flickering light. I settled onto the couch with a book, feeling more relaxed than I had in weeks. The quiet was comforting, like a blanket wrapping around me. Around 10 p.m., I decided to call it a night. The bedroom was small, with just a bed and a nightstand. I turned off the lantern I'd been using and crawled under the heavy quilt. The mattress was old and lumpy, but I didn't care. I closed my eyes, listening to the sounds of the fire dying down in the next room and the rhythmic chirping of the crickets outside. It didn't take long for me to fall asleep. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night. At first, I wasn't sure why. The cabin was silent, except for the faint creaks of the wooden beams as they expanded and contracted in the cool night air. I lay there for a moment, trying to figure out what had pulled me from sleep. That's when I noticed it, the faint sound of footsteps outside. My heart started pounding. I told myself it was probably just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but the steps didn't sound like an animal. They were deliberate, measured, and slow. I stayed completely still, straining to hear. The footsteps seemed to circle the cabin, moving from one side to the other. Whoever it was, whatever it was walking just beyond the walls. I wanted to get up and look, but fear kept me pinned to the bed. My mind raced through possibilities. A hunter? A hiker who'd gotten lost? But why would they be walking around the cabin in the middle of the night without knocking or calling out? The sound of the footsteps stopped suddenly. The silence was almost worse than the noise. I lay there, holding my breath, waiting for something to happen. Minutes passed, maybe more. I finally convinced myself it was nothing and tried to go back to sleep. Just as I was drifting off, I heard it again. This time it was louder, closer. It sounded like it was coming from the front porch. The wooden boards creaked under the weight of someone's steps. My stomach dropped. Someone was out there. I slipped out of bed as quietly as I could, my heart hammering in my chest. I grabbed the flashlight from my bag and crept toward the living room. The fire had gone out, leaving the room in complete darkness. I made my way to the window, careful not to make a sound. Slowly, I pulled back the curtain and shined the flashlight outside. Nothing. The porch was empty. The clearing beyond was bathed in pale moonlight, and the forest loomed dark and silent. I felt a mix of relief and unease. Maybe I'd imagined it. Maybe the creaking was just the wind or the old wood settling. I let the curtain fall back into place and turned to head back to bed. That's when I saw it, the muddy footprint on the wooden floor. My blood ran cold. It was unmistakable, the outline of a boot large, probably a man's. And it wasn't mine. I hadn't stepped in anything muddy, and I'd taken off my shoes when I arrived. Someone had been inside. I froze, my mind racing. How long had they been here? Were they still inside? I felt exposed, vulnerable. The cabin suddenly seemed much smaller, the walls closing in around me. I backed away slowly, my eyes scanning the room. Everything looked the same as before, but now it felt different, like the space had been violated. I grabbed a fire poker from beside the hearth, holding it like a weapon. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. My breathing was shallow, and every sound seemed amplified. I checked the front door. It was locked, just as I'd left it. I moved to the windows, peeking out cautiously. The forest was still, the clearing empty. I spent the rest of the night sitting on the couch, the fire poker in one hand and the flashlight in the other. I didn't dare close my eyes. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle of leaves outside, set my nerves on edge. The hours dragged by, and I kept replaying the sound of those footsteps in my head. Who had been out there? Why hadn't they tried to come in? Or had they? Maybe they'd been watching me the whole time, waiting for the right moment. When the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I felt a wave of relief. The night was over. I packed my things quickly, not bothering to eat or clean up. I just wanted to get out of there. As I stepped outside, I noticed more footprints in the dirt around the cabin. They circled the building, just as I'd heard the night before. Some led off into the forest, disappearing among the trees. I didn't stick around to investigate. I got in my car, locked the doors, and started the engine. The drive back felt longer than the drive there, every shadow in the trees making me jumpy. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following me. By the time I reached the main road, I felt like I could finally breathe again. I never found out who it was or what they wanted. Maybe it was a drifter, someone looking for a place to stay the night. Maybe it was something more sinister. I'll never know. But one thing's for sure, I won't be going back to that cabin. Whatever peace I'd hoped to find out there was swallowed up by the lingering fear of what might have happened if I'd stayed one more night. The sun was just starting to rise when I parked my car at the trailhead. The air was crisp, biting even, and the faint glow of dawn painted the trees in muted shades of orange and pink. My plan was simple: a solo hike through the woods to clear my head and disconnect from the constant hum of everyday life. I'd chosen this trail for its solitude. It wasn't particularly well known, which meant fewer people. That's exactly what I wanted, to feel alone with nature. The first few steps onto the trail were exhilarating. The crunch of gravel beneath my boots and the scent of pine trees were comforting in their simplicity. The trail wound its way through a dense forest, the trees standing tall and proud, their branches forming a canopy that filtered the early morning light into a soft glow. It was peaceful, almost surreal. I felt like I was walking through a painting. The first hour passed without incident. I stopped occasionally to admire the scenery. A squirrel darting up a tree, a stream trickling over moss-covered rocks, the way the wind made the leaves dance in unison. My phone was tucked deep in my backpack. I'd promised myself I wouldn't check it unless absolutely necessary. I wanted to be present, to soak in every detail of the wilderness. About 3 miles in, the trail began to climb. It was gradual at first, but soon the incline became steeper. I welcomed the challenge. My legs burned as I pushed myself upward, the exertion a reminder of my physical limitations. The higher I climbed, the more the forest opened up. I could see the tops of the trees below me, a sea of green that stretched as far as the eye could see. It was breathtaking. Then, I noticed something odd. A faint rustling sound, just off the trail to my left. I stopped and listened, my heart beating a little faster. Could have been anything. A bird, a deer, maybe even a fox. But the sound didn't fade. It seemed to follow me as I resumed my hike. I told myself it was nothing, just the forest's natural soundtrack. The trail leveled out after the climb, leading me into a flat, open area dotted with wildflowers. I paused to catch my breath and drink some water. The rustling had stopped, or maybe I'd just stopped noticing it. Either way, I felt more at ease. I lingered for a while, letting the serenity of the meadow wash over me. As I moved on, the trail narrowed, the trees closing in around me once more. The sunlight struggled to penetrate the thick canopy, casting long shadows that danced with the movement of the leaves. It was darker here, quieter. Even the birds seemed to have moved on to brighter pastures. I felt a chill run down my spine, though the air wasn't particularly cold. I'd been walking for nearly 3 hours when I reached a fork in the trail. One path was well-trodden, its dirt packed firmly by countless hikers. The other was overgrown, the underbrush encroaching on what little remained of the trail. My map indicated that both routes would eventually lead to the same destination, but the overgrown path was shorter. I hesitated for a moment before deciding to take the less traveled route. It would save me time, and besides, I'd always been drawn to the idea of exploring paths few others dared to tread. The overgrown trail was rough. Branches snagged at my clothes, and I had to step carefully to avoid tripping over roots and rocks. The forest here felt different, older, wilder. The trees were gnarled and twisted, their bark covered in thick layers of moss. It was beautiful in a haunting sort of way. I felt like I was walking through a place untouched by time. As I pushed forward, the rustling sound returned. This time it was louder, more deliberate. I stopped and scanned the forest, my heart thudding in my chest. There was nothing, no movement, no sign of life, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I shook it off and kept moving, telling myself I was just being paranoid. The forest had a way of playing tricks on the mind. About a mile into the overgrown trail, I stumbled upon something unexpected. An old cabin, partially hidden by the trees. It was small, with a slanted roof and weathered wood that had turned gray with age. The windows were broken, and the door hung slightly ajar. Curiosity got the better of me, and I approached cautiously. It looked abandoned, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I peered inside. The interior was dark, the only light coming from the gaps in the walls and the broken windows. There was a table, a chair, and what looked like a makeshift bed. Everything was covered in a thick layer of dust and cobwebs. It was clear no one had lived here for a long time. Still, I couldn't shake the unease that had settled in my chest. Something about the cabin felt off, like it didn't belong here. I didn't stay long. The feeling of being watched was too strong, and I was eager to put some distance between myself and the cabin. I picked up my pace, the narrow trail forcing me to focus on each step. The rustling sound had stopped again, but the silence felt heavy, oppressive. I couldn't wait to get back to the main trail. That's when I saw it. A footprint, fresh and unmistakable, in the dirt ahead of me. It wasn't mine, the tread was different. My heart sank. I wasn't alone. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Someone else was out here, someone who'd been walking this same overgrown trail. My mind raced with possibilities. Maybe it was another hiker, but why take this path? It didn't make sense. I kept moving, my senses on high alert. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves set my nerves on edge. The forest felt alive in a way that was anything but comforting. I glanced over my shoulder more than once, half expecting to see someone following me. But there was no one, just the endless stretch of trees. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I reached the end of the overgrown trail. It merged back into the main path, the dirt smooth and well-trodden. Relief washed over me. I was back in familiar territory, and the unease that had gripped me began to fade. I told myself I'd imagined most of it, the rustling, the feeling of being watched. The footprint could have been from days ago, left by another hiker who'd ventured down the same trail. The rest of the hike passed without incident. The forest seemed friendlier, the sunlight brighter. By the time I reached the parking lot, the events of the day felt like a distant memory, something my mind had exaggerated in the moment. I climbed into my car, exhausted but relieved, and drove away. It wasn't until I got home and unpacked my gear that I found the note. A small piece of paper, folded neatly, tucked into the side pocket of my backpack. My blood ran cold as I unfolded it. For words, scrawled in shaky handwriting, "You were not alone. I don't hike alone anymore." The old cabin stood silently among the trees, shrouded in a dense fog that clung to the ground like a second skin. The air was damp and heavy, thick with the smell of wet pine and earth. I had come up here to get away from everything. Just me and nature, no distractions, no noise, no people. I thought it would be the perfect escape. I had been warned. The locals around the small town at the foot of the mountains had given me strange looks when I asked about the cabin. Some had even advised me to reconsider renting it, but I wasn't interested in their superstitions. I needed silence, and a cabin like this seemed like just the place to find it. The cabin was isolated, far from any roads or nearby houses, the kind of place you could only reach by foot or by driving along a narrow dirt path that seemed to disappear into the wilderness. The owner, an older man with a shaky voice, handed me the key and told me to be careful. I thought little of it. People are always warning you about things, especially when they don't want you to do something. When I arrived, the place was exactly as I expected. A small, single-story structure with a slanted roof and dark wood that looked aged but sturdy. The windows were grimy, and the door creaked when I pushed it open. Inside, the air smelled musty, like something had been sitting undisturbed for far too long. Dust covered the surfaces, and cobwebs clung to the corners. It wasn't unpleasant, though. Felt lived in, though long abandoned. I dropped my bags by the door and locked it behind me. The first night was peaceful. Too peaceful, maybe. The silence was so complete, it felt like the world outside had simply stopped existing. The only sound I could hear was the occasional rustling of the trees, but even that felt distant, muffled by the heavy fog that had settled in the valley. I spent the day exploring the area around the cabin. The woods were dense, with thick underbrush and towering trees that seemed to stretch endlessly into the sky. It was beautiful in a way untouched by human hands. But as the hours passed, a strange feeling began to settle in my chest, something I couldn't explain. It was a weight, a pressure, as if the forest was watching me, waiting for me to leave or make a mistake. I brushed it off as nerves. After all, being alone in the wilderness for the first time can play tricks on your mind. That night, I built a fire in the cabin's small stone fireplace and settled in with a book. The crackling flames cast long shadows on the walls, and the warmth felt comforting. Then, as the night deepened, I heard it. At first, it was just a faint sound, a soft tapping. I thought it was just the wind, maybe a branch tapping against the cabin. But then it came again, louder this time. The sound was too rhythmic, too deliberate. It wasn't wind, it wasn't a branch. It was something else. My heart started pounding, but I told myself it was just an animal outside, maybe a squirrel or a raccoon. The tapping continued, now accompanied by a low, grinding noise. I froze, listening. It was coming from the roof. I didn't want to go outside. I didn't want to check. But the curiosity gnawed at me, pulling me out of my chair and towards the door. I grabbed a flashlight from my bag and hesitated, standing there in the quiet cabin, the tapping still echoing above me. I stepped outside onto the small porch, shining the beam of light up toward the roof. The flashlight flickered for a moment before settling on the wooden shingles, and I could see nothing. But the tapping didn't stop. It was louder now, as if something was moving across the roof, dragging its feet. I backed away from the porch, trying to convince myself it was just the wind, the weight of snow or ice shifting on the roof. But then, as I stood there, something caught my eye. A shape, dark and subtle, moved along the edge of the roof. A figure, small but distinct, crouched in the shadows, blending with the dark wood. I couldn't move. My legs felt like they were frozen in place. My breath caught in my throat. For a long moment, the figure stayed still, almost like it was waiting for me to react. Then, just as quickly as it appeared, it vanished into the trees, disappearing into the fog without a sound. I stood there for a while, staring at the empty roof, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. But there was no rational explanation. No wind, no animals, nothing that could explain it. My heart was racing. I wanted to go inside, lock the door, and never step foot outside again. But I didn't. I stood there, frozen, as the night seemed to grow colder and the air heavier. Eventually, I did go back inside, closing the door behind me with shaking hands. The tapping had stopped, but the feeling didn't leave. The sense that I wasn't alone, that something was still out there watching. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind outside made my pulse spike. I kept the flashlight on my bedstand, ready to shine it at the smallest noise. But nothing else happened. The rest of the night passed in a strange, uneasy silence. In the morning, I told myself it had just been my imagination. I'd been alone too long, my mind playing tricks on me. I decided to spend the next day exploring further into the woods, hoping to clear my head. I gathered my things, put on my jacket, and stepped outside. The fog had lifted somewhat, and the sun was beginning to peek through the trees. The forest seemed less oppressive, but the unease still lingered. I walked deeper into the woods, away from the cabin, until the trees grew thicker, their trunks twisted and gnarled. The silence was almost deafening, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. I stopped for a moment, trying to listen for any sound, but there was nothing, not even the birds. That's when I heard it again, the sound of something moving through the underbrush. It wasn't close, but it was definitely there, just beyond my vision. I turned quickly, but saw nothing, just the trees, the empty air. I wasn't sure how much longer I could take this. The isolation was starting to get to me. I needed to leave, but something told me I had to stay, that I hadn't found the answers yet. I made my way back to the cabin, my footsteps quick and uneven. As I approached the door, I noticed something strange. The doorknob was turned, slightly ajar. I hadn't left it like that. I knew I hadn't. I stood there for a moment, staring at the door. Something was wrong. But what? I pushed the door open slowly, my heart in my throat. Inside, everything seemed just as I had left it. The furniture, the fireplace, the shelves filled with old books. But there was a subtle change. The dust on the floor was disturbed, like someone had been walking around. Small footprints led from the door to the corner of the room, where a chair had been moved slightly out of place. I stepped inside, feeling the coldness of the room seep into my bones. I couldn't understand it. No one else had been there, or had they? Then, from behind me, I heard the sound of footsteps. Light, quick, but unmistakable. I spun around, my heart racing, but the room was empty. The door was still closed, the cabin still silent. The footsteps stopped. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my things, bolted the door behind me, and ran into the woods. I didn't look back. My legs burned, my breath came in ragged gasps, but I didn't stop. The fog was thick again, and the trees closed in around me, but I didn't care. I just needed to get out. When I finally reached the small road that led back to town, I didn't feel relief. I felt numb. My hands trembled, and my body shook with exhaustion. I didn't stop until I was back in the town, sitting in my car, staring at the road ahead. What had happened in that cabin? What had I seen? What had I heard? The townspeople weren't surprised to see me back early. They simply nodded, their expressions unreadable. The owner of the cabin had left a note for me at the local inn, asking if I'd had a good stay. I never responded. Some things are better left unexplored. I don't know what it was that I felt in that cabin, or who or what had been watching me from the shadows. But I don't need to know, and I don't ever want to go back. The air smelled faintly of pine and damp earth. The dirt road stretched endlessly ahead, framed by towering trees on either side. The car's engine hummed steadily, a comforting sound against the otherwise oppressive silence. I glanced at the fuel gauge. The needle was dangerously close to E. I cursed under my breath, regretting my decision to take the back roads instead of sticking to the highway. It had seemed like a good idea earlier in the day. Avoid traffic, take in the scenery, save a little time. But now, as the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the road, The isolation felt less charming and more unsettling. No other cars had passed me for hours. I checked my phone again, but the no service icon mocked me from the corner of the screen. Ahead, the road curved sharply. As I rounded the bend, I spotted a wooden sign half hidden by overgrown bushes. Maple Hollow, 2 miles. Relief flooded through me. A town, even a small one, meant gas, food, and maybe a chance to stretch my legs. I pressed the accelerator slightly, eager to make it there before nightfall. The road narrowed further as I drove, the trees closing in until their branches seemed to form a canopy overhead. Dappled sunlight filtered through the leaves, casting shifting patterns on the dirt road. It was beautiful in a way, but it also made me feel like I was being swallowed whole by the forest. My hands gripped the steering wheel a little tighter. When I finally reached Maple Hollow, it was smaller than I'd expected. Much smaller. A cluster of weathered buildings lined the single street, their paint peeling and windows clouded with grime. There was a gas station, though, and that was all I cared about. I pulled up to the pump, shut off the engine, and stepped out of the car. The air was cooler than I'd anticipated, with a faint chill that hinted at the coming night. The station looked like it hadn't been updated in decades. The pumps were old-fashioned, with analog dials instead of digital screens. A bell jingled faintly as I stepped into the small convenience store attached to the station. The interior smelled of stale cigarettes and something metallic. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding too loud in the quiet space. No response. The counter was empty, though a half-empty coffee cup sat next to an ancient-looking cash register. I rang the little silver bell on the counter and waited. Still nothing. The longer I stood there, the more aware I became of the silence. No hum of refrigeration units, no distant chatter, no background music. Just nothing. I decided to pump the gas first and sort out payment later. As I walked back to my car, I noticed the faint crunch of gravel beneath my feet. It seemed louder than it should have, like the quiet of the town was amplifying every sound. I filled up the tank quickly, my eyes darting around the empty street. There were no cars parked anywhere, no people walking around. The whole place felt abandoned. Once the tank was full, I went back inside to leave some cash on the counter. That's when I noticed the note. It was taped to the register, written in uneven block letters. "Take what you need and leave. Do not stay after dark." My stomach dropped. I stared at the note, trying to make sense of it. Was it some kind of joke? A warning? My eyes darted to the coffee cup again. It was still warm, faint wisps of steam curling up from the surface. Someone had been here recently. I called out again, louder this time. "Hello? Is anyone here?" No answer. A prickling sensation crawled up the back of my neck. I left the cash on the counter and hurried back to my car. I wanted to get out of this place as fast as possible. As I slid into the driver's seat and started the engine, I glanced at the dashboard clock. 5:47 p.m. The sun was already sinking below the treetops, casting the town in deepening shadows. I pulled back onto the road, heading out of Maple Hollow. The trees loomed closer than ever, their branches almost brushing the sides of the car. The further I drove, the darker it got. The narrow road twisted and turned, the dense forest blocking out what little light remained. My headlights carved a path through the darkness, illuminating the dirt road and the occasional reflective eyes of small animals darting across it. Then the engine sputtered. "No, no, no," I muttered, my grip tightening on the wheel. The car lurched forward a few more feet before the engine died completely. I coasted to a stop, the headlights dimming until I was left in near total darkness. Panic bubbled up in my chest. I tried the ignition again, but the engine only groaned in protest. I grabbed my phone, hoping for a miracle, but the screen still displayed no service. I was miles from Maple Hollow now, deep in the middle of nowhere. My heart pounded as I considered my options. I could stay in the car and wait for help, though the chances of someone passing by seemed slim. Or I could try to walk back to the town, though the idea of trekking through the forest at night sent a shiver down my spine. I decided to stay put. At least the car offered some semblance of safety. I locked the doors and leaned back in the seat, trying to calm my racing thoughts. Minutes passed, maybe hours. The darkness outside the windows was absolute, pressing in on all sides. Every now and then, I thought I heard something. A faint rustling, a distant snap of a branch. I told myself it was just animals, the normal sounds of the forest at night. But then there was a knock. It was soft, almost tentative, but unmistakable. A single, deliberate tap on the driver's side window. My blood ran cold. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. Slowly, I turned my head to look. There was nothing there, just darkness. Another knock, this time on the rear window. My heart felt like it might burst out of my chest. I couldn't see anything, but the sound was clear, deliberate. Someone or something was out there. I fumbled for the flashlight I kept in the glove compartment, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped it. When I finally managed to turn it on, the beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees outside. The forest was still silent. Nothing moved, no sign of anyone. I sat there, gripping the flashlight like a lifeline, trying to convince myself I'd imagined the knocks. Maybe it was just the car settling, or an animal brushing against the window. But deep down, I knew better. Then I saw it. A faint, almost imperceptible movement in the trees. Something pale, low to the ground, darting between the trunks. My breath hitched. I aimed the flashlight towards it, but whatever it was disappeared before the beam could catch it. My mind raced. A coyote? A deer? No, it had moved too fast, too deliberately. I didn't wait to find out. I tried the ignition again, desperation overriding logic. The engine sputtered weakly, then roared to life. Relief surged through me as I threw the car into gear and sped down the road. I didn't care where I was going, as long as it was away from here. The road seemed endless, the darkness pressing in on all sides. My eyes darted between the windshield and the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something, anything, chasing me. But the road behind remained empty. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I saw a faint glow in the distance. Streetlights. I burst out of the forest onto a paved highway, my tires screeching as they hit the asphalt. Civilization. Safety. I didn't stop until I reached a brightly lit gas station miles down the road. I parked under the harsh fluorescent lights, my hands still trembling as I cut the engine. Inside, the cashier gave me a strange look as I stumbled in, disheveled and wide-eyed. "You okay?" she asked. I nodded, though I wasn't sure it was true. "Just had some car trouble," I mumbled. I stayed there for a while, sipping bad coffee and letting the harsh light and background noise soothe my nerves. I didn't tell anyone about the knocks or the movement in the trees. I wasn't even sure I believed it myself. But as I got back on the road, heading for home, one thought lingered in my mind. I should have listened to the note. It was supposed to be a simple solo camping trip, a way to clear my head and escape from the humdrum of everyday life. I had always loved the outdoors, the stillness of nature, and the solitude of being completely alone under a canopy of stars. But nothing could have prepared me for the chain of events that would unfold. I chose a remote area in the Pacific Northwest, far from any towns or marked trails. It was a spot recommended by an online forum for experienced backpackers, a hidden gem, they called it. To reach it, I had to park my car on a dirt road and hike nearly 10 miles through dense forest. The trail was unmarked, and I relied on a combination of GPS, a printed map, and my own sense of direction to navigate. The journey was grueling, with steep inclines, muddy patches, and thick underbrush, but I felt a sense of accomplishment as I reached the clearing where I planned to set up camp. The clearing was perfect. Tall pines surrounded the area, their tops swaying gently in the breeze. A small stream trickled nearby, providing a constant, soothing sound. I pitched my tent near the edge of the clearing, where the ground was level and the trees offered some shade. By late afternoon, my camp was fully set up. The tent was staked, my gear was organized, and a small fire pit was ready to be lit. I felt a deep sense of satisfaction, the kind that only comes from hard work and self-reliance. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the forest came alive with sounds. Crickets chirped, frogs croaked, and the occasional rustle of leaves hinted at small animals moving through the underbrush. I sat by the fire, eating a simple meal of dehydrated pasta and sipping hot tea. The stars began to appear, one by one, until the sky was a glittering expanse of light. I felt at peace, completely disconnected from the chaos of modern life. That peace was short-lived. The first sign of trouble came in the middle of the night. I woke to a faint noise outside my tent, a soft but distinct crunching sound. At first, I dismissed it as a deer or some other nocturnal animal. But as I lay there, straining to listen, the noise grew louder and more deliberate. It wasn't the random rustling of an animal foraging for food. It was the sound of footsteps, slow and measured, circling my tent. My heart pounded as I reached for my flashlight and pocket knife. The beam of light cut through the darkness as I unzipped the tent and shone it outside. The clearing was empty. The trees stood silently, their shadows long and eerie under the moonlight. I scanned the area, my breath coming in short gasps, but I saw nothing. The footsteps had stopped. Convincing myself it was just my imagination, I retreated back into the tent. But sleep was impossible. Every small sound seemed amplified, every rustle a potential threat. I lay awake, gripping the knife tightly, until the first light of dawn filtered through the fabric of the tent. The next day, I tried to shake off the unease. I told myself it had to be an animal, maybe even the echo of my own movements as I settled into the tent. To distract myself, I spent the morning exploring the surrounding area. The forest was beautiful, with towering trees, moss-covered rocks, and patches of wildflowers. I followed the stream for a while, marveling at its crystal-clear water and the occasional flash of a trout darting through the current. By midday, I felt more relaxed. The sunlight streaming through the trees made everything seem less ominous, and I started to enjoy the solitude again. I even found a small waterfall a short distance upstream, its cascading water creating a mist that sparkled in the sunlight. I sat there for a while, letting the sound of the rushing water wash over me. But the feeling of unease returned that evening. As I cooked my dinner over the campfire, I couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and I found myself constantly glancing over my shoulder. The forest, which had seemed so inviting during the day, now felt oppressive. The shadows between the trees seemed darker, deeper, as if they were hiding something. That night, the footsteps returned. This time, they were louder, more insistent. They circled the tent again, stopping and starting as if whoever or whatever was out there wanted me to know they were there. My heart raced as I clutched the knife, my mind racing with possibilities. Was it a bear? A mountain lion? Or something worse? I didn't dare look outside. Instead, I sat there in the dark, every muscle in my body tense, listening to the sound of those deliberate steps. They continued for what felt like hours before finally fading away. When dawn broke, I emerged from the tent, exhausted and on edge. The clearing was empty, just as it had been the previous night. But this time, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Footprints. Human footprints circling my tent. Panic set in. I knew I had to leave. I quickly packed up my gear, constantly glancing around the clearing, expecting to see someone emerge from the trees. The hike back to my car was the longest and most nerve-wracking journey of my life. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, sent my heart racing. I kept looking over my shoulder, convinced I was being followed. When I finally reached my car, I threw my gear into the back seat and sped off without a second glance. As the miles between me and the forest grew, I started to feel a sense of relief. But that relief was short-lived. A week later, I was scrolling through the news when I came across a headline that made my stomach drop. Missing hiker found dead in remote forest. The article described a man who had been found not far from the area where I had camped. He had been missing for several days, and his body showed signs of a struggle. The cause of death was still under investigation, but foul play was suspected. To this day, I can't shake the feeling that I narrowly escaped something terrible. I've replayed those nights in the forest over and over in my mind, trying to make sense of what happened. Who was out there? Why were they circling my tent? And most importantly, why did they let me go? I haven't been camping since. The thought of being alone in the wilderness, miles from help, fills me with a deep, primal fear. The forest, once a place of peace and solitude, is now a place of unanswered questions and lingering dread.